Welcome to the MHB podcast. This is Michael Bond, and welcome to my 141st episode. Today I have something extra special for you. This is the very first conversation to ever be recorded on this podcast. I'll be speaking with Steve Miller. Steve is the senior pastor at Faith Country Chapel. I know him as a well-read, deep thinker who challenges ideas before integrating them into his worldview. Steve has been in pastoral ministry far longer than I have, and undoubtedly these years have brought him valuable insight. The idea to record this conversation actually came after the decision to have it. It's fair enough to say that all of us have been walking through very strange and very tumultuous times. One of the most disturbing elements of these times is the tribal nature of our political division. It has nearly crippled our country's ability to work effectively together. We are losing our ability to have conversations with people who disagree with us. Conversation is central to the American project, and I don't believe the Republic can survive without it. Steve and I share this concern. I decided to reach out to Steve because I could sense there was some space between him and I concerning social justice. If both of us were required to articulate our thoughts on this topic into a single thesis statement, it would sound like we disagree with each other. But as is often the case, the irreconcilability of these disagreements is probably an illusion which disappears once we drill down in conversation. It's likely that Steve and I desire the same outcomes, which gives us great hope for being able to understand one another. But even if we didn't desire the same outcomes, as long as we know how to have a conversation, then there's no reason why we couldn't come to a compromise. The major problem facing our society is not about who has the correct answers. It's about the near total breakdown in our ability to talk with one another. Before recording this conversation, I was confident of two things. First was that Steve and I do not see eye to eye on the issue of social justice. Second was that despite our disagreements, he and I would be able to have a productive conversation which uncovers my blind spots, his blind spots, and helps us to arrive at a mutual understanding that leaves both of us stronger, smarter, and better than before we talked. This is the process that will pull our country back from the brink. This is the only process that will pull our country back from the brink. So we decided to record this conversation and post it to our platforms, with the hope that others could listen to it and use it as one example for how to have these discussions. I hope you gain as much value by listening to this conversation as I did by having it. So without further delay, I bring you Pastor Steve Miller. I am here with Steve Miller. Steve, thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here.
Let me just start by asking you how you've been handling 2020 as a lead pastor. What have you learned about doing ministry during a pandemic? How have you navigated the waters of social unrest?
Not well. That's the short answer, I suppose. No, it's been some of the most exhausting pastoral work I've done, just because there were weeks when I spent half of my week just trying to refigure out how to do ministry in ways that I had never done ministry before. And so it kind of forced me into some new areas of ministry and doing things differently. I'm doing things right now in some very old-fashioned ways, but also trying to use technology to reach, because I've got a very diverse congregation. And so it's just kind of forced me into a lot of new stuff that I'm not really comfortable with. But I think it's been good. It's been good for me. It's been interesting. It's exhausting, tiring. I'm ready for it to be over. I'm not sure when it's going to be over, but I'm ready.
Yeah, definitely. For me, sort of at first, I was kind of unquestioningly accepting the advice of the experts. I even did a couple podcasts on just sort of outlining what I thought was happening and why I thought people should be just sticking with the CDC guidelines. And I still try to give as much credibility to the experts as I can, but the problem is the advice has been so swamped in rhetoric and it's been so heavily politicized that it's becoming more and more difficult to have the conversation about what to do virus side of things with even just people in the congregation. But
I was going to say, we've just really struggled with that lately, trying to figure out how to, because we did the same thing. We announced to the church from the beginning, we're going to stick by CDC guidelines. And now, 3 months later, CDC guidelines are still the same, despite the fact that in my county, we're getting almost no cases. We have had very little impact. And so do we react the same as we would if we were in the Philly area? And so it's a struggle to answer those questions.
Right. Yeah, I've sort of consolidated everything down to just telling people to do three things. And those would just be like wash your hands every time you enter your house, don't touch your face in public, and try to keep like a 6 feet of social distance when you're in public. And I chose those three things because they're all sort of individual dependent. So like each person can do that for themselves and they don't have to worry about what other people are doing and the hygiene that other people are taking. Because I thought that if everybody starts thinking, well, if other people aren't following the guidelines, I'm at risk, then they're just going to be stressed out all the time. And so I tried to give them something that they themselves could hold to. And I was actually hopeful about masks at first, but even that, people seem to think that they can figure out your politics based on whether or not you're wearing a mask. And so I don't know how effective those are going to be, but it's definitely been interesting. And it's a good opportunity, I guess, for us to learn. I mean, how many people know how to do pastoral ministry during a global pandemic? I mean, it's like new knowledge for a lot of people, I'm sure. But
yeah, we can all write books.
Right. So our main topic of conversation today is going to be social justice with a particular focus on race relations. Before we jump into that, let's just see if we can find some points of agreement. What does the world look like to you 10 years from now if it's going to be better than it is today?
If it's going to be better than it is today, we're going to have to rediscover as the church in America the central tenets of Christianity. Our calling as the Great Commission, our command to love God and love people, and our citizenship, which is kingdom first. And I think if we do that, the church could see revival. I'm afraid if we don't do that, and if we continue to allow ourselves to be polarized by politics and by pandemics and all that kind of stuff, I'm afraid that'll wreck the church. I think there's hope if we can kind of pull ourselves back to those three things: our calling, the basic command, the most important commands, and then where our citizenship really lies. I think if we can do that, we can find where we need to be as a church in America.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah. It seems to me like if we're able to sort of get away from the group identity aspect, and if we're going to have a group identity, it should be as Christians. It should be as citizens of the kingdom of God. And then apart from that, it seems like the other group identities that people are sort of ascribing to themselves seem to be more harmful than helpful in the sense of the division. And I actually think that if we can get closer to meritocracy, that's where I would sort of want to be. I want important positions of leadership and productivity to be occupied by the best qualified candidates, regardless of their gender, their color, their sexual orientation, or any of these other sort of group characteristics. I think if we can reward and incentivize our most competent people, then all of us will benefit as a consequence. One example that I had thought about when I was thinking about this was Amazon. So when I think about Amazon, I think about Jeff Bezos having, I don't know if he actually has $100 billion, but his net worth is tremendously high. And he's frequently cited as a villain of income inequality and wealth inequality. And when I think about Amazon and Bezos, what I try to think about is I just kind of have to live with the fact that he's worth so much. And if I do, I have the benefit of being able to shop online and have everything delivered right to my door in 2 days. And that his company has essentially revolutionized the way that we shop altogether, maybe even not just online. I think about people like Bezos and Bill Gates with Windows and all the philanthropic work that he's doing. Imagine if you took Bill Gates' wealth and you divided it up among everyone in America. You might be able to give everybody like a $300 check. But if his resources are where they are with him, his foundation has been able to make major contributions toward the progress of curing 5 of the most difficult global diseases. There's polio, guinea worm, elephantiasis, river blindness, and blinding trachoma, I think are the ones that I think in the next 15 years they're going to make major headway on. So I guess I look at these economic power players and I try to think, well, how much benefit are they bringing to everyone and to me? And is it sort of like a rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing? I mean, there's definitely wealth inequality, but do we want to lose that in our efforts to level the wealth inequality? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I struggle with the wealth inequality thing. I mean, I think most reasonable thinking people do, and kind of knowing the answer to that, I certainly don't think the answer to that is emptying out every rich person's bank account and spreading that wealth to every citizen of the United States. I would like to see more being done by some of these that are in the 1% and the 3%. I'd like to see more of them investing back into the communities that they pull resources from. You think about Amazon. Amazon just recently opened up a new place here in Pittsburgh, and some of the people were really upset about it because, like, some of them loved it, new jobs, but they're like, but these aren't the kind of jobs we need in Pittsburgh. We need jobs in Pittsburgh that are going to help the lowest, the most at risk people to be able to leverage his wealth for the sake of Pittsburgh, for the sake of Pennsylvania, for the sake. And so I'd like to see that more. I'm not sure how that happens. I'm not a big proponent of government oversight on all of this stuff. But I've been really encouraged when I've read stories and heard stories about CEOs who are essentially doing just that. Taking the same bonus as all of their employees or things like that in order to really incentivize people who work for them, of course, but also to help generate greater incomes for the people that are at the bottom of the ladder.
Yeah. It kind of makes me think of Elon Musk and how when he wanted to get his factory back to work, he went in and got on the line himself and essentially said, well, if you're going to come and arrest these people, I'd rather you just arrest me. And so he's sort of getting down on the ground with his people. And I agree totally. Like the more, when you get to that level of wealth, if you can get back down on the ground and see where people need help and try to help them as much as you can, that's definitely, it's like my concern, I guess, is that there's sort of a lot of push, and I don't necessarily think that this is your position, but there is a big position that exists that sort of is pushing back against even the possibility of billionaires, let alone multi-billionaires. And I try to look at this from as many different perspectives as I can, and the one that sort of makes the most sense to me is that I don't actually think that these kinds of innovative revolutions would be possible. I mean, if they're possible, they'd be much harder to produce without embracing capitalist economics. So, for instance, I think you need rich people who are willing to pay for overpriced, cutting-edge products so that the company who made that product will have enough resources to research and develop the next generation of products, as well as build infrastructure for mass market production. And I think without mass market production, many high-end products, like even the stuff that we're using right now for this podcast at one time was a cutting-edge high-end product, but they're widely available now, mostly because of mass market production and because the generations move so quickly into the next products. I kind of think that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is one of the things I think we'll actually come back to this conversation a little bit later on, because my big concern is that some of these companies are doing it off of the backs of the least fortunate, as opposed to lifting them. They're not really helping the situations. And I think I don't have a problem with rich being rich as long as it's not at the expense of the poor. If it's rising the whole tide, I'm for it. If it's keeping others down, I'm against it. And that's kind of the way I look at it, regardless of what it is, frankly, whether it's money or anything else. I think we just have to be able to navigate that. And that's a difficult water to navigate, especially in a capitalistic society, without using government oversight. And so I don't know exactly what the answer is or how to do that, except just, frankly, it's just people on the ground who need to make smart purchasing decisions and letting people who are the sellers know why they've chosen to buy the product or not buy a product from a certain company. And I think if we can do more of that, but of course that takes education. That takes education of the masses, and that's not easy to do, especially when we live in this divided world where if one camp says it, then the other camp doesn't believe it, even if it's true, and that's a real problem that we're facing, obviously. But yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I think somebody who is pro-capitalism, even for them to make the concession in certain situations, it is a zero-sum game. And if somebody ascends the hierarchy to a billionaire status, it is because they leveraged people lesser than them. And so even for a pro-capitalist person to make that concession in this climate seems really rare. But I think you're right in the sense that certain companies do their business more nefariously and make gains that are illegitimate. And then there are also companies that make their gains through innovation and through technological revolution and those sorts of things. And being able to have the nuance and being able to look at it closely enough to see on like an individual basis who's doing what is probably the key to being able to maintain the benefits of capitalism without abandoning it, but also being able to try to solve some of those injustices. And that kind of gets back to kind of what we're trying to do in having conversation from differing perspectives and trying to find points of agreement. And I think that the more people learn how to do that, the better we'll be able to solve these problems.
Yeah, definitely.
What do you think about policies like affirmative action and policies that sort of try to place people on criteria apart from merit? Are those a net good or a net bad? How do you see that?
I'm sorry, ask the question again for me so I'm understanding exactly what you're asking.
So affirmative action or any kind of program or thought process that would try to place someone in a position that's on the basis of something other than merit.
I think there's obviously danger in that. There's danger in kind of forcing people's hands. We have to understand why it was necessary for a time, and I think perhaps in some areas it's still necessary. The goal, of course, is for it to not be necessary anymore, and for people to be able to be promoted based purely on whether they're able to do the job and succeed and cause others around them to succeed. And I think as long as we as a country get to that place, it's kind of funny that the first thing I think of, maybe not the first thing, but one of the things I always think about during this conversation is the NFL and coaches in the NFL. And the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers pushed for essentially this. He said, we need to have a percentage of African American coaches in the NFL, and we need to push that. And so people need to hire. And of course, he went out and he was like, he's going to put his money where his mouth is. He hired Tomlin, made a lot of people mad for doing that. In the Pittsburgh area, they wanted what's his name that went to Arizona, but then 10, 15 years later, he came back and said, okay, this problem has been solved. We're seeing the rise of these coaches that are actually performing better. And so I think that there needs to be some give and take on that. I think we need to do better. I think we need to sometimes, for the sake of diversity, we need to look for people who are different than everyone else at the table, because by their diversity, they bring strength to the room. And so we might have to look harder for somebody. Like if you have a board of a company that's 10 people and you're getting ready to bring a new person on and everyone's white or everyone's male or everyone's female, I think you would do your company well to intentionally search out somebody who is strong, who will be exactly what you need for the fit, but will bring some of the diversity in, whether that's based on color of their skin or gender, simply because that strengthens a team. I mean, studies have shown again and again that if you're willing to fight through the difficulty of diversity, it ends up making you stronger in the end. It ends up making companies stronger. And of course, I think of this a lot from the church, but it makes churches stronger as well. It's a tough fight sometimes, and it might mean you have to look harder. It might mean you have to look outside of your immediate circle, but I think in the end it's worth it. I don't know that the government needs a mandate, but I think there's been a time and a place, and maybe in some areas there still is that. I couldn't say that for sure one way or another.
I really like the take that you took on that about positively, intentionally searching for people. I think if we do that, if companies were to do that, they could keep the standard what it is. There's maybe a couple different kinds of affirmative action in the sense that you could have the affirmative action that lowers the standard as a gateway to bring more diversity in. But you don't have to do that in the sense, because I think about important things like heart surgery, for example. If you're going in to have a heart surgery and you have a black surgeon who has a track record of hundreds of successful surgeries and he's experienced, he has a very high success rate. And then you have another choice of maybe like a white surgeon, and the white surgeon has multiple malpractice suits, a spotty record of, and maybe not very much experience. I don't know anyone in my own sphere who would be so racist to choose the white surgeon in that scenario, because when something important and difficult arises, like the problem of needing heart surgery, these sort of superficial things that we think about, like racism, seem to fade into the background. As far as the selection process, people tend to still select for competence, and they still tend to admire behaviors and behavior patterns that lend themselves towards competence. And so what I really like about what you said was that this idea that we can intentionally pursue people who look different than what we have on staff while keeping the standard at what it is, because we have the faith that we'll find that person, and that we don't need to lower the standard on the basis of something like race.
And the thing is like, and this is why I think who you listen to on issues like racism is really important. And one of the voices that I have chosen to listen to, just 2 or 3 days ago, he was tweeting about this and said, in this climate, a lot of companies and churches are going to be looking for minorities to be on their staff, and they're going to settle for something less than what they should, and that doesn't honor God. That doesn't do your company well. And so we want the standard to be the same level, as long as that's not a level that we're using to intentionally exclude someone.
For sure. Yeah, that's good. So have you been finding yourself at odds with most evangelicals on race relations? And if you are, why do you think that is?
I find myself at odds with white laity. I make that distinction for both of those reasons. There are a lot of African American evangelicals, and as almost an entirety, they would speak very vocally about racism when given the ability to do so. Even pastors and leaders in my own community, we had a prayer time just on Saturday with some of the local leaders, and it was a closed room group. It wasn't open to the public. There were about 10 or 12 of us that were pastors and church leaders, and given the ability to do so, some of them were speaking very honestly about things that they have seen. And so there's no problem from the black evangelicals. And there's a lot less problem with pastors and church and people who are above that level, like denominational leaders and things like that. And I think the reason is because they've exposed themselves to more voices. As I have kind of walked this path, I tend to search for new things to read and new things to study. And so sometimes by accident, I've opened myself up to voices who spoke very openly about an issue that I wasn't really familiar with and comfortable with. And so I've discovered that other pastors and leaders are more prone. It's not like an across the board, but like I'm almost completely alone if I'm just talking about me versus laity. Not completely. I mean, I said almost completely. There's a smaller contingent. A lot of that depends on their environment. But I find that people who are more educated tend to be more likely to know some of what's going on behind the scenes. And a lot of that depends on churches too. What kind of churches they're attending. That's going to make a big factor into it. And we're still, and this kind of leads into one of the big problems we face in our country today, is that we're still segregated on Sunday mornings. And so that's the reason you ask the why. Why would I feel alone among white laity? The reason is because all the white laity are hanging out together, and all the black laity are hanging out together. They still say that 80% of congregations are dominated by one race. 80% of congregations in the United States are dominated. That means 80% or higher, and a lot of times it's a lot higher than that, are dominated by one race. So whether that's white or black or whatever. And so, and on top of that, they found out that most congregations are okay with that. They don't want diversity in their congregations. Most of them don't. That's different when it comes to church leadership. Church leadership tends to want diversity. Laity tend to not want diversity. And so that's why we've ended up with this kind of a void, this chasm, it seems, between the two.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that until you mentioned it, the idea of congregations being sort of segregated that way and not multicultural. Because I remember being at a conference and hearing Brian Loritz talk about that as sort of his pet project of trying to push forward to like a multicultural church. And I thought that was a really good idea. I mean, I think that the church is the basis of community. And if there's going to be a way for everyone to sort of come together and understand each other, it seems like that's very unlikely to happen if the churches remain sort of separated. I think the people that you had termed sort of the white laity, I think they resist race relations discussions. They might have one good reason for doing that, and I'll talk about it, and then you can tell me what you think about this reason. But I think that conversations about race tend to force them into conversations about group identity. And I think that it's one thing to sort of help someone on an individual level. And I would say that we have a biblical mandate to help people on an individual level, to help those that are the least of us. I think that this care sort of has to take place on an individual level because each individual has different needs. But conversations about race seem to resist the individual level of analysis in favor of group identity. And I think we can talk about sort of the biblical establishment for individual analysis. I thought that Acts chapter 10, verses 34 and 35, "So Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Truly, I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, any one who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him.'" Seems to me like a look at the individual rather than the group. You can comment on that if you want, but the sense that I get from many white evangelicals is that they don't aspire to be prejudiced based on a person's group identity, but they do wish to maintain the liberty of pointing out bad behavior regardless of group identity. And I think that when we start talking about race, they kind of think that I can't criticize this person if this person's black, or if this person's white, then they get lumped in with the sins of the white collective. What do you think about that, the idea of the group versus the individual? And do you think that there's a way to have a conversation about race, maybe if we spend less time focusing on the group, which is weird because that's what race denotes. It denotes a group in some sense.
I actually think the exact opposite. Biblically speaking, when the Bible talks about salvation, it is almost exclusively group, not individual. And so when you dig into the Greek and all of that stuff, into the language stuff, you discover that all the passages that talk about what it means to be a Christian and what you're supposed to do as a church, they're not saying what are you, they're saying what are, like, not singular you but plural you. What are you as a body? And what's happened, and this has been something that was really kind of revolutionary for me about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was reading somebody that was talking about how we have failed as the white community to really appreciate a lot of the depth of the New Testament, and we would have gained that had we been closer to the black community, because they understand group dynamics better than we do. We don't do the group. We're all about the individual, all about me and mine. We're all about that personal identity, but that's not Christian. The Christian identity is constantly in pictures of the whole. We are the body of Christ. We are the house. We are the city on a hill. We are all of these things that are not individual. And so, yes, we are made up of individuals, but those individuals are only truly the church of Jesus Christ when we're bonded together. And so for this reason, this is why so many commandments in the Bible they require you to be in community. You cannot be a Christian alone. Like it is a biblical impossibility, because all the things like bear one another, scold one another, correct one another, encourage one another daily, as long as it is today. And Hebrews 10 is big on this idea of how important it is to have this community, and we can't deny the community. We have to remember that. And as the white Christian identity has often fallen really short of this, which is why it's really hard to have race conversations, because the black community, when George Floyd gets killed, they all feel it. Like, it hurts as a unit. A white guy dies, I this isn't meant to be bad, but like, I don't feel that. Now, my understanding is some of that has to do with just like sociologically, that has to do a lot with what it's like to be a minority in a majority culture. So like if you're you're a black person in America, that's going to be more likely to happen. You tend to have that sense of kind of a group mentality. I was reading something about like even Asian basketball players and how much they enjoyed celebrity status when they came to America in a sense, but because they were minorities, there was so much that was going on. Like the specific example, and I wish I could remember where I read this, but it was talking about Yao Ming and the things that he was facing as this really popular figure, but how much his home country loved him coming over here and representing their country. Well, there was this, he's one of us, and he's going into this white culture, and he is dominating a white sport, so to speak, which it certainly is not. Or even a black. I mean, you could certainly say, I mean, the NBA, there's more black athletes than white, and so but here he is coming in as an Asian, and he's able to dominate in this sport, and so it was such a big deal for them as a community. They felt that pride that came along with that. Whereas if a white guy does that, it's just no big deal for us. And so I actually go the opposite direction. I don't think the black community needs to begin to speak individually. I think the white community needs to understand the communal aspects of the intended created order that we find in Scripture, both Old and New Testament, really.
So do you think that there's like a shadow side to group identity? Would you say that something like white guilt or group atonement and those sorts of things are judging groups rather than judging individuals? My concern, I guess, is just the problem of blanket judgments. And can you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't think we need blanket anything. I don't think we need blanket judgments. I think that's just as racist when it goes one way as the other. But I want to take this communal aspect the next step, because I'm not sure I'm making myself completely clear. When it comes to, I'm going to get a little deeper into like soteriology, the theology of salvation, a little bit here, but in soteriology, there's two main branches. There's Arminianism and Calvinism within the Protestant movement. And a lot of the struggles with the interpretation of those two lies in Romans. A lot of it can be taken back to Romans chapters 13 through, or chapters 9 through 11. Sorry, 9 through 11. And so this Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. There's a lot of that dynamic that Calvinists, I feel, get wrong because they approach Romans from an individual standpoint, because they approach salvation. But salvation in Scripture is never about the individual. It's all about the whole. And so when God says, I have chosen you, he's not talking about, I have chosen you specifically. He's not talking about he's chosen Steve. He's talking about how he has chosen those who accept the call of salvation to be part of his body, to be part of his family. And so there's that communal aspect. It's not just about me serving another people. It's about the fact that my very identity is found within the body of Christ. And so everything that I do and say and am and I'm about and all the things that I'm striving for, they have to be about that, which has been such a big deal for me, because that also, during times of racial tension, even if I don't understand it, don't like it, whatever, I've got African American, black brothers and sisters in Christ who are in pain, who are in turmoil, and if they're in pain, I need to be hurting with them. And so there's a lot of that I've tried to, and I'm certainly not there yet. That's something that's my journey. That's part of my journey right now. But like feeling that anguish with them, as we should be feeling with one another. I mean, anytime we should have that sort of empathy. And a deeper empathy. And so I'm not into the white guilt stuff. I'm not into that I don't feel guilty for being white. I don't feel guilty for having ancestors that may or may not have oppressed. I don't know my specific genealogy. And so I'm not necessarily feeling that, but at the same time, I feel like there is responsibility as a community for us to respond well to the other community as much as we can.
This is kind of good, because I think that what you're sort of trying to chase down is that we should have unity under Christ, that wherever we go, that should be our superordinate group identity. To be individual all the way up to the top, where it's just me and God, And so I could walk through life as an individual and I don't need brothers and sisters in Christ and I don't need a community. I don't need the body of Christ. That's not the right way of thinking about it. If your supreme top group identity is as a Christian, then you can sort of do away with the other group identities. And I actually kind of think that the other group identities resist the Christian group identity. Well, a good example is the Calvinists or the people who follow Arminianism. You could say like, okay, well, I'm a Wesleyan, I'm a Calvinist. Well, there you have two different group identities that serve really only to divide the body of Christ. And so I kind of think that the group identities that are hashed out in our politics are antithetical to being unified under Christ. And I kind of think that's where I was sort of trying to get to with why I think that white evangelicals have that sense almost in their body when it comes to discussions about race, but they don't really know how to articulate it. There's just this sense of like, well, why can't we just all be Christians? Why can't we all just be together and unified under Christ and do away with the other cultural group identities?
Well, the problem with that in our situation, so I can't speak of other countries and other times. I can only speak of the United States that I live in right now. The problem with going down that road too far, though, is that what we've effectively done is we've told people who are living oppressed lives, stop complaining. I don't want to hear it. We're just all Christians. And so we have a responsibility, if we're going to say we are the body of Christ, we have a responsibility to lift the fallen. I mean, this is the prophecies over and over again about how the people of Israel were not caring for the poor and the oppressed among them. And if we're not caring for the poor and oppressed among us, we can't claim to be the body of Christ. If the song by Casting Crowns from years ago, if we're the body, why aren't his feet going? Why aren't his hands helping? Why aren't we actually, if we're going to say we're the body of Christ, if we're going to identify with Christ, we have to live like him. And Jesus never ignored the oppressed. He came up alongside of them, oftentimes at the expense of the people who were the oppressor. Actually, almost always at the expense of the oppressor. He would lift up the oppressed. When it wasn't at the expense of the oppressor, he would do it in the face of the oppressor. So sometimes it didn't necessarily cost them, but it did cost them some pride. With the way he would handle in front of them. And so I'm okay with doing that and with saying that, well, we struggle with that because of identity and all of those things. But what I've seen instead is that a lot of the people within the white evangelical community were so afraid to talk about it because it opens up really uncomfortable doors about things that I've been ignoring. It's not so much that I need to feel guilt. I don't need to feel guilt. And I will tell you that I don't think most white evangelicals are racist. I just think we're ignoring the racism that's going on in the world around us. I shouldn't say most. I guess I can't speak for most. But in my community, I don't think most would be genuinely, mostly, I don't think, racist people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Personally, I want to be careful with the oppressor-oppressed in relation to modern politics and what we're experiencing right now. But I do want to say that I really agree with that point about how if we are negligent in caring for the least among us, then that's going to cause sub-Christian group identity to form because people have to care for each other if they're not being cared for. I mean, they have to be able to get through life. And if the church is neglecting its duty to, in benevolence or wherever it is, trying to help rebuild communities, then those communities are going to tighten up around each other and form group identities. And then, maybe even the other communities will form group identities in response to that. And so I could see where you have like a chain reaction that starts with wanting to shut our eyes to the things which are unfair about life in general and wanting to pretend like it's not there. That can lead to further group identity that resists Christian unity. I really like that idea of using benevolence as a way to break down the necessity of having group identity that is not Christian group identity. So I think it's valuable for us to identify various straw men which people are using to cut each other down. By doing this, we can show how our actual perspectives are not the same as these misrepresentations. So in what ways have you noticed people misrepresenting your thoughts on this topic?
I don't know how much people have misrepresented me personally, mostly because I find that people don't want to talk to me about it, if I'm being totally honest. They're uncomfortable with the conversation. And I think part of that is because, and this would maybe be a straw man, is there's a sense of, well, he just doesn't understand, or he hasn't really thought this through, or he hasn't thought about this aspect, even though I lived 30 years caught up in that bubble. And so it's not like it, and I'm still consumed by those. I'm seeing the same things that they're seeing and hearing the same things they're hearing now. And so that's been one that I feel like is a straw man. It's a way to try to, well, he's just not educated. Of course, we do that everywhere in every bit of society, I'm afraid. But I haven't had much like personal pushback because of that, because I just haven't had much as in a way of actual genuine conversation about this.
Yeah, I haven't had a whole lot of conversations, which is alarming to me. I mean, that's alarming that there's a very small number of people who are having it out with each other using talking points, and that's how we're developing our worldview on this topic, because we can't or we won't talk to each other, and it's really tough. If I did have this conversation with somebody who is intentionally trying to straw man me, I think that what they would try to do would involve the expansion of the definition of racism. And it was in the news a couple days ago that Merriam-Webster intends to revise their definition of racism because they thought that it didn't include enough about systemic racism. I disagree with that move, but we can talk about systemic racism later. So the current definition that they have is that racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That seems pretty much dead on to me. I mean, I think that to expand that runs the risk of including things into the definition which aren't actually that. What's your opinion on this idea of the expansion of the definition of racism? Do you think that's happening? Do you think that's dangerous?
Do I think that definition of racism is correct and that is happening, like that specific type of racism? Is that what you're asking? Or that people are trying to expand it and they shouldn't?
Yes. Do you think people are trying to expand it and that they should not try to expand it?
I think some people are trying to expand it, and I think the opposite of that is happening as well. I think some people are trying to minimize what racism is in order to deny that it exists. And so I think there's danger on both sides of that coin. If we minimize it, then nobody's racist. If we maximize it, pretty much we all are. Mm-hmm. And so we have to find something that actually is a working definition, I think. And I think that one is good. I think there are other ones that are probably similar, just worded differently. I don't know that I like the idea of adding systemic racism. I know we'll talk about that later. I do believe it exists, but I prefer to leave it as a different thing, because I think that when we lump too much together, then we confuse the actual original topic. And I don't want to confuse racism because it exists in other forms. And so let's just define those forms. If we want to define the forms of systemic racism, let's just call it systemic racism and deal with that as it stands. It becomes a lot harder when you widen that. You know, like you were saying, if you widen that too much, not only is everybody a racist or most people are racist, but also it's really hard to talk about it. You can't have a conversation about something that's defined too widely, and you can't make progress. And that's my goal.
Say if I would argue for meritocracy and free markets, people tend to think that that's my implicit support of systemic racism, and they usually suggest that I want a meritocracy because my white privilege gives me an advantage in such a system. I think that these claims of white privilege ignore the fact that some of the poorest regions of our country are white dominated. So, for instance, Eastern Kentucky, for example, it's routinely ranked among the worst places to live in America. Clay County has almost half of their residents living. It's considered one of the poorest counties in the nation, and it's 94% white. I would agree that meritocracy does privilege certain individuals, but it's hard for me to make the case that this privilege is doled out solely on the basis of race. I think the trait which most reliably predicts success in Western systems is intelligence. There are also characteristics which provide privilege like temperament, geography, historical time, attractiveness, youth, age, physical health, mental health, sex, wealth, family structure, relationships, and education. I think the reason why we have so many successful Black people is because despite the disadvantage of being in the minority group, the deck was stacked in their favor along one or many of these other areas of privilege, whether it be like athleticism, attractiveness, whatever it be, youth, age, intelligence. there's more going on in the meritocracy than skin color. And I think that's the most popular straw man that I would tend to face if I had these conversations more often, would be that, well, okay, well, you just want meritocracy because all hierarchies are predicated on power and you have the power. So, and that's, I don't think all hierarchies are predicated on power, but that seems to be what comes from the far left movement more frequently than not. So what's your opinion on all that?
Well, as you were listing your thing, your list of things that provide, advantage to somebody, I was actually just kind of, okay, but white people have the advantage there, and white people have the advantage there, and white people have the advantage there, and white people have the advantage there. And we're going to cover some of those things in our conversation, I think, as we proceed. But like that's my problem, is that I do believe that the system in America is more geared toward aiding the white person than the black person, and part of that is not so much due to what we are dealing with today, but it's the fact that we haven't dealt with some of the things that we did in the past. And so some of this kind of just goes back to, we have to deal with some of the systems that are in place and some of the harm that we've already caused, and we have to figure out a way around that doesn't destroy communities, that lifts communities up, but also doesn't seek to either demonize or minimize the people within those communities. And so, of course, you're going to get your places like Kentucky, where you're going to have a bunch of white people that live out in the woods. And I mean, those people, I've driven through Kentucky a few times. I lived in Tennessee. I was just I worked with a guy who had a house that I wouldn't have a dog live in, that I worked with. He was a white guy. That's just the way he was. But the number of people in those per 100 units is far more likely to be black than white. The disparity between those is going to be pretty large. So I don't disagree that some of the advantages can be overcome and some of the advantages can be dealt with, but we just have to be aware of the disadvantages if we're going to deal with those. Cover some of those again as we proceed.
What do we do with individuals who transcend the disadvantages? I would say people like, for instance, Jimi Hendrix, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, President Barack Obama, and his wife Michelle. The Obamas are considered two of the most influential people of our generation. When black people ascend the hierarchy, I don't see where their skin color is really detracting from their success if they were able to leverage these other areas.
So first of all, there's always going to be outliers. There are always going to be people who beat the system. And I think, I'm not sure. Sometimes I think we should separate athletes from this conversation, because it's a different story entirely for people. But of course, we have to also recognize that a lot of those athletes, that was the only way they were getting out, was by their sports abilities. Is probably why they've worked harder at it, some of them, than those within other communities. But you get these. We tend to, and I actually think probably it's a bit of a straw man argument itself, that we tend to say, well, what about these people? What about your Barack and Michelle Obamas? What about your people who are very successful in life and who have been very successful, whether they're in the business world or the athletic world, or actors and actresses and so on and so forth? So you get all of that. But then when you begin to go back and look at that, you realize they are the exception to the rule. There's a reason Barack Obama stands out. And Malcolm Gladwell did a study about this where he talked about the idea that having a black president basically just gives us an excuse to be more racist, because we can point to him and say, hey, look, we have a black president. We're not racist. And then we proceed to go on and do whatever we want to do. And he talked about this historically in other venues as well, where this is kind of sprung up, and whether it was a sexist thing from back in 200-300 years ago with paintings. And so he talks about this a lot. And I think that's one of the problems, is we don't necessarily stop and think, okay, so why is it such a big deal that a black man became a president? Well, it's a big deal because no one thought he had a shot. I mean, come on, they put him in there assuming he was going to lose. He was not intended to be the Democrat who was going to run for president, and still suddenly people started to follow him. He was kind of their token guy, and so Republicans have that as well. That's not a Democrat-Republican thing. That's just politics. And so most of the people in power are white. That's just the facts. That's just that when you look at and we're doing better with that as a nation. And so I'm not trying to paint this as a blanket, but when we use people who are outliers as evidence that there's not a problem, I think we're actually we're kind of beating our own argument. If there are outliers, they're outliers for a reason. Because that's not the majority.
If you have one black person out of 300 who's doing well, and you say, oh, look, well, we have our one black person who's doing well, so apparently there's no problem, that would certainly not be the right way of thinking about it. It does seem to be like there's a little bit of a double standard there, though, in the sense that Obama's presidency, in particular, him winning the presidency was seen as like an important and necessary step for black progress in America. And if we can celebrate it in that moment, but then not celebrate it in the instance of pointing out where we have made progress. And I get the fear there, because like the fear is, well, if we identify progress we have made, then maybe we won't want to push for the progress we still need.
I agree with you, and we have to be careful with the double standards. I think we should have celebrated that. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, I think it's worth celebrating the fact that we had a person of color, a minority, who was a president, and I think that does speak well for our country. We just have to be cautious not to oversell it. I guess that's more my concern. I just don't want to oversell the outliers because they're still outliers. When we have, and I don't mean to be getting too political with this, and I apologize, but when you looked at the Democratic candidates that were running, there were like 15 of them, and they were all white, and so like they're back where they were before Obama. And so have we made progress? I don't know. I mean, maybe we've made some. Do we have room to grow? I think we do. So I guess that's maybe that's not the road you were intending to take, but I think it's good. I think we should point out these things. We should celebrate the successes. We should honor those things. But actually, one interesting illustration is I've heard people within the Hollywood industry who have kind of complained that black actors and actresses get nominated for Oscars and win Oscars when they are portrayed as slaves or when they are the people who are being mistreated during the Jim Crow era. They never win one for the reasons that white people may win them. And I think it's just kind of they want to be celebrated as actors and actresses, not actors and actresses who were for a cause, so to speak, Like, can't you just celebrate the fact that I'm a good actor, not that I acted in this movie that's supposed to tell an important story? By all means, let's tell the story. By all means, let's do all of those things. Let's celebrate those successes. But they've been kind of upset that they haven't been able to be celebrated by Hollywood for just being normal people, for not being the slave, the 12 Years a Slave, and you could go on. There's tons of examples about that. I mean, Halle Berry, who won the first, that's what she portrayed in that. That was a movie that had tons of racial tension in it, and so, well, that's good. We can celebrate that, but we also have to recognize in that celebration that there's improvement that needs to be made in really all aspect of American culture.
I'm right with you on the idea of if this person's really talented at what they do, if they're a talented engineer, they're a talented engineer, whatever color they are. The closer we can get to that, then the better. And it's weird because if you try to take that tack, that color blindness approach, I'm hearing a lot of pushback from a lot of people left of center will seem to push back on the color blindness aspect because, well, if you say you're colorblind, then your biases are just implicit. But I don't know how we get to that place that you were talking about where we can celebrate people for being excellent at what it is they're doing instead of trying to preface it with, oh, this is an excellent black actor. Just saying this is an excellent actor. I don't know how we get there. Like, I would like to see a situation where skin color is no different than like hair color. We don't think, oh, this is the best brown-haired actor. We think this is the best actor. And so if we can get to that point, but as long as we're attaching so many other things to skin color, I think it's a really hard project.
I don't use the term colorblind for a couple of reasons. One is just that I think when we say colorblind, the problem is that can blind us to the problems of minorities. Well, if I'm colorblind, then there are no problems that are only facing people of color. And so I don't want to say I'm colorblind for that reason. The other thing is biblical. I I think God created us to be all different colors, and I think there's beauty in that. I think it shows a side of God's creativity and God's blessing on humanity. And when we get to heaven, there's going to be people of all different colors standing at the throne, And so I celebrate color. I don't say I'm colorblind. I celebrate color. I acknowledge color. I do all of those things. I am actually physically colorblind, and I can tell you it's not fun. So it's boring. And I've used this illustration before that when I lived in Connecticut for a few years when I was growing up, and my parents used to love to go out and drive the hills of Connecticut when the leaves would change colors, because there's all these beautiful colors. And meanwhile, I'm colorblind, and so I take a book because it's boring. It's boring. You see all these vibrant colors. I just see different shades of green. It's not really doing anything for me. And so I think that's a boring world that's colorblind. And so when it comes to color of skin, I think that ignores beautiful cultures. I think that ignores the beautiful print, the fingerprints of God on skin and on hair, and all these things that make us different from one another. I think there's beauty in that, and we should celebrate those, not pretend that they don't exist. So I actually don't like the colorblind for that reason.
I'm with you on that up to a point. Let's just hang on this idea for a second. I want to celebrate cultures also, but I want to celebrate aspects of culture that align with Christ-like values. There are parts of white culture you could find that are diametrically opposed to Christ-like values, and I want to dispense with those. But there are also parts of black culture that are opposed to Christ-like values, and I want to dispense with those also. And so I think we run into this problem where if we have protected classes and protected cultures, let's say, I mean, it's so sensitive at this point that even if you wear the dress of a different culture, you get accused of appropriating. And I think, well, okay, we can't celebrate culture that way then because we can't participate in it in that way. But then we certainly can't. It's like certain things should be marginalized. Certain aspects of any culture that are not in alignment with Christ-like values, I think should be marginalized. But if we embrace diversity for the sake of diversity, we kind of surrender our ability to encourage what is right and discourage what is wrong.
Yeah, I would agree with that, 100%. Yep, I'm definitely with you.
What was your initial reaction to the George Floyd video? I mean, do you think that this was a case where yielding to our emotions has undermined the principle of due process?
My initial reaction was pain and anger and sadness. It just kind of broke my heart to see it again. And the due process thing concerns me because not because we don't believe in due process. It's because the evidence is there. It's like I always got a little irritated when I'd be watching the news and they'd say, we have this video evidence of this alleged robber, and they'd show his picture and show the video of him robbing the store. And it's like, he's not alleged. He just robbed that store. Like, that has nothing to do with skin color to me. This is not a race issue here. If he did the crime, he did the crime. We have video evidence that he did the crime. And in the case of George Floyd, there's video evidence. So take away the emotions of it, and his due process needed. He certainly still needs to go through the court systems. Of course, we have a court system for a reason. We need to determine whether the force he was using was unlawful and all of those things. And I get that. I believe in those things as long as they're done well and done properly and all of that. We talk about the guilty until proven innocent thing, or innocent until proven guilty. Which one is it? Which one is it? Which one is it? And to me, at some point, we have to say, but there's a video. Like we're witnessing it. This isn't a made up video. This isn't. We've got tons of witnesses. We don't need to see any more evidence to arrest the man and to put him through the process of being held accountable for his crimes.
Yeah, for sure. It was a horrifying video, and I had that same sort of emotional gut reaction. I kind of try to resist that just because I'm nervous about how dangerous it is. So, for instance, in this case, we seem to have pretty clear-cut evidence of what happened. But If we allow ourselves to make that leap on the basis of the video, then a year from now, we might have a video that's a little bit less clear. And then we'll have a precedent of, well, it was on video, so we can go ahead and make the jump. I've tried to put my faith in due process and in the justice system in the sense that I'm horrified by what I saw. Out of principle, I'm going to just stop with my judgment and see where the evidence leads. What is the verdict as a consequence of due process? I want to try to stay there with myself because of how dangerous it is if we depart from that sort of anchor, like where we can float off to in the way that we do justice. And it's certainly the case that people get off that shouldn't get off, and that the justice system has problems in that way. Have you heard of, I think it's called Blackstone's law or Blackstone's principle or something like that? It's the idea is better for 100 guilty people to go free than for one innocent man to be condemned. If we get away from due process, the doors for abuse fly open. And even in the worst, most horrific, clear-cut cases, I still just out of principle try to say, okay, let's just calm down and let the court system handle this.
Yeah, I'm definitely not for, okay, we saw it, let's go hang the guy. Like, I don't think at that point he should be pronounced guilty of first-degree murder. But I do think at that point he should have been arrested. And I think that's where the protests and the problems came in. It wasn't so much that he committed the murder, it's that he committed the murder and it seemed like he wasn't going to be held accountable for the murder. And so my thing with all of this stuff is like there's precedent set in pretty much any venue. I have somebody that I know that was working at a job and was accused of sexual misconduct, and they said, we have to lay you off for a month. We have to investigate this. We have to do the due process. But meanwhile, we have it in our policy that you can't come to work because we need to investigate. And I think that those kinds of things are good. That's safe. That's probably the right thing to do in that particular instance. As far as I know, the person was innocent. But at the same time, there's a process. There's a precedent that they have. There's established things that they have set. And I think that for police officers who kill someone in the line of duty, particularly in an incident where there was no weapon involved from the person that they killed, there should be immediate repercussions, not necessarily punishments, but there should be, and maybe repercussions is the wrong word, but there should be immediate action taken by those who enforce the law over that police officer. So maybe he should have been immediately suspended pending an investigation. Maybe he should have been arrested and then let go on parole. I don't know what the exact answer is. I don't pretend to know all the ins and outs of the law, but something should have immediately happened at that. I think at that point that something should have happened. And the fact that it took a few days is where the problem lies. So I'm all for due process. I think he needs to go through the court of law. I think everyone is guaranteed the right of trial. And I think he needs to be allowed that, just as I would say anyone needs to be allowed that.
I agree that when something like that happens, until you have a verdict, if you have clear enough proof to charge the person, they have to be pulled out of the public. If somebody just does a murder, you have to get them out of the public because they could do it again. They're a danger at that point. And so I certainly agree that life can't just go on as normal if you do something like that and there's enough evidence to indict you for it. Let's just take a different angle on the George Floyd incident. Do you think that the American public made an unjustified assumption in claiming Floyd's murder was racially inspired?
I don't know that the majority of people would say that the officer was racist. I could be wrong about that. But that's not what I'm hearing to the voices that I'm listening to. They're not claiming that the officer himself was racist. They're claiming that a system that would make him feel safe going that far and killing a man in public with cameras on him and other officers around him, that if he felt safe doing that, then that's the system that's wrong. That's the problem. The problem isn't necessarily him. Now, was he racist? I don't have any idea. I've never met the guy. I don't know the guy. Even if I'd met him, I don't know that I'm allowed to judge the heart and the intent of a person. Maybe unless it's blatant and you know it. And so all of this, like, well, maybe he knew him beforehand and there was a beef. None of that matters. None of that matters to the actual case. The actual case, the actual situation is the one we see, and that's what he needs to be judged on and determined on. And so I'm not seeing a lot of the individual, and maybe I'm just missing it. But I think that, well, let me say, I'll go back. I think this is a straw man argument. I think that if we say, well, you don't know that he's racist, well, then we can automatically chalk this up as, well, he was just doing his job and something messed up. Well, but whether he was racist or not has nothing to do with whether or not he was allowed to do what he did. Like, this is not a racist view. This is a question of police brutality. And if that's the question at hand, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the ones who I am listening to are concerned.
It's definitely the case that we don't know that he wasn't racist either. And I think that's something to keep in mind also, because sort of the truth of it is that we see a video of what happened, but we can't see a video inside his mind. Let's talk about the organization called Black Lives Matter. Do you support this organization, or do you find yourself having differences with them?
I have... I would guess we're not far apart on this. I don't support the organization. I don't support them. The foundation of their ideology is a problem. But that being said, I do support a lot of what they're supporting. I don't necessarily support it for the same reason that they do, but I think there's space there. It's kind of like everything in the world. Like, if we don't agree on everything, but if there are things we can agree on, and if the main tenet of their argument is that Black Lives Matter, well, we can agree on that. We don't have a problem. You know, we agree 100% that Black Lives matter, and that they need to matter as much as white lives and blue lives, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't have a problem with that. And a lot of the things that they're fighting for are good. Now, there are some things they're fighting for that I'm definitely not in line with. But yeah, so I guess that's where I stand.
I'm just going to go through what I've tried to determine, or at least two of their premises that they work from. And so premise number one is that America is systemically racist, and this racism is evidenced by police brutality. Now, the way they're defining systemic racism, I tend not to agree with. So premise one, at least the way that they're defining systemic racism, and that racism is evidenced by police brutality, I'm going to try to make the case for why I disagree with that. And so to do that, I'm just going to read some information. Let me go through some of the stuff that I was able to find. So police officers make about 10 million arrests per year. In 2019, they fatally shot 1,004 people, most of whom were armed and dangerous. So this means that 0.01% of arrests that were made resulted in fatalities. Of these 1,004 fatalities, 235 were black. This means that 3 times more white people were killed by police than black people. And that ratio has been stable since about 2015. In 2018, the most recent year for which this data is available, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders and committed 60% of armed robberies, despite being only 13% of the U.S. population. In 2019, police fatally shot 9 unarmed blacks and 19 unarmed whites. The definition of unarmed is used broadly enough to include people who have a loaded weapon inside their car. In 2018, there were 7,407 black homicide victims. If you assume that 2019 is comparable, this means police shootings are responsible for just 0.1% of African Americans killed. So a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than a black male is to be killed by a police officer. A 2015 Justice Department analysis of the Philadelphia PD found that white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. Harvard economist Roland G. Fryer found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. In order to build, I think his claim is that in order to build racism into the data, you have to ignore crime rates and civilian behavior during interactions with police. And so when I go over that data, it suggests to me that not only are police officers not racist, but they actually go out of their way to avoid harming black suspects. It comes as no surprise in some sense, at least in the modern day, like in the last decade or so, that would be the case because of the immense public backlash that comes when you're involved in such an incident. So if you need me to go through any of that again, I can, but do you think that the data, at least in the last decade, is pointing us in the direction of police are actually less likely to harm a black person?
Well, I don't know. I could go a couple of different directions with this, I suppose. Let me start with this. If this stats were, and if I tell me if I got this wrong, but 30% of arrests were black people, and so 30% as opposed to 70%. But was that arrests or violent crimes? But anyway, the population is 13%. So that means that more per capita of violence is being done toward black people than white people. That's an important stat. Also more arrests per capita. Most people will tell you that in different studies that have been done, you're more likely to get pulled over by a cop if you're black. Actually, I think those statistics are fairly close. I think the black to white ratio of being pulled over is fairly close, kind of depending on where you live. But you're more likely to be pulled out of your car if you're black than if you're white. You're more likely to have your car searched if you're black than you're white. And so we can point that to crime and say, well, that's because they commit more crime than white people. But it kind of seems to be a circular argument. And so I tend to avoid that. When I define systemic racism, I don't talk about police brutality. I think police brutality is a problem because we have bad apples. Like I think there are some, and they are a minority. I would like to think, I believe that they're an extreme minority of police officers that are simply not held accountable. Are some of them racist? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, some of them are racist. Some of them are terribly racist, and they use that as an excuse. The problem that I see is broader and bigger than that, and so that's I don't know how far you want to go down that road right now, but I don't tend to look at police brutality as a sign of systemic racism. I look at police brutality as a problem of mostly within the police culture. There are issues with police not feeling like they can tell on another police officer. You can't report another police officer, or you're kind of looked down upon because we're supposed to stand with one another, even if that's at the expense of justice. There are problems with the unions within the police officers. That the talk at this point is that if George Floyd's murderer gets thrown in prison for second-degree murder, he still gets his pension. Like, that's a problem. That's not rewarding him. It's just not punishing him enough, right? I mean, like, you shouldn't be able to get hundreds of thousands of dollars of your pension for being a police officer who murdered a man, if he's found guilty of murder, right? Like, that's, to me, that should, but the unions have essentially protected. And so my problem with police brutality is just on the fact that sometimes we're afraid to hold the few police officers accountable. And I have to be very fair about that. I see that same thing happening in the church with pastors. There have been a lot of, during the Me Too movement, there have been a lot of sexually abusive stuff that have come out about pastors and youth pastors, and they're all kind of covered up by the leadership in the church. It's like, well, we don't want people to know that there are bad apples among us. And now that they're all coming to light, it's making a lot of people kind of have to step back and say, okay, is there something we need to think about? Is there something and so I think churches need to deal with that. And I think police officers need to deal with that. I think in all fields, we need to hold each other accountable. And I think good police officers want to. One of the things I have loved the most during all of these protests and stuff is seeing videos of police officers who are protesting police brutality, who are getting into the crowds of the protesters and talking to them. And, there's videos of them saying, we agree with you, but, you have to do this and we'll do this. And I've loved to see that because I think it shows the heart of most police officers, that they genuinely want the good of their community. You don't become a police officer and put your life on the line. Some people do it because they have a power trip, but some people get into every field. A lot of people are politicians because they have a power trip. So you're going to get police officers that do that. And like I said, you're going to get some that are racist. You're going to get some that are criminals to the core. That's just going to happen. They're going to slip through the cracks. And so if we hold them accountable, I think we'll have less of a problem with police brutality. But I don't necessarily see that as a big systemic racism problem.
The main reason why I bring up police brutality in reference to Black Lives Matter is mostly to challenge Black Lives Matter and the organization, and also to send the message to Black people that they don't have to be terrified of police. Like, it's heartbreaking to me that, because here's why this is so bad, okay? Because Black people do get racially profiled by police. Now, we can talk about the reasons for that, but it is true. Now, if you couple that with a bad narrative about how police are highly likely to shoot and kill you for no reason because you're Black, that sets people up to just be living in constant stress and anxiety. And that's terrible to me. And like, when the reason the data was so shocking to me is because not only does it appear as if police are not hunting Black people, but they actually, when they interact with Black people, they tend to go out of their way not to cause them direct harm. I guess I just want to send the message that police shouldn't be feared. The second premise that they have is that Western systems are primarily characterized by oppression. It seems to me like they are protesting the entire American system. And the only reason you would do that is if the system was racist to the core and primarily characterized by oppression of minorities. If you're going to determine whether or not a government or an economic system is functioning properly or working properly, you have to examine data concerning hallmarks of prosperity. And so Steven Pinker from Harvard, psychologist from Harvard, did a pretty good talk on this in 2018 called Enlightenment Now. He does a lot of work trying to show people that the world is getting better in general, even though we see a lot of media that suggests the world is getting worse. There's at least 17 dimensions along which we've seen improvements. So like homicide rates are down, poverty is down, pollution is down, wars, autocracies, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, life expectancy, infant mortality, famines, annual rate of war, like the deadliness of war, democracy, the prevalence of democracy in the world, rule of law, and what rule of law has been able to do for societies and communities. Our infrastructure has improved, literacy has improved, hours work are less than they used to be, and other happiness indicators and psychological experimentation also appear to be up. The reason why I'm citing all that is because I find it really dangerous, this idea of like wholesale change to the system, particularly when you see so many areas where everyone, like this is an example of the rising tide lifting all boats. And I fear if we do away with the system because it's predicated on racist power hierarchies, then we end up losing all of those dimensions of prosperity. They don't create themselves. I mean, there's things about the world that we have real problems like entropy, scarcity, disease. Like these things are not socially constructed. I mean, if you don't eat, you're going to starve, whether you live in a communist country or a capitalist country. If you get sick, then you're just sick. It's not the white patriarchy that did those things to you. And I think that our system is doing so well at combating these sorts of problems that are endemic to a fallen creation. It's doing so well at combating them that we tend not to think about them and focus on problems that are socially constructed. And my fear is that if we do away with the system, then all of these other problems are going to come after us like a tsunami. And we're not going to have the unity, we're not going to have the innovation, we're not going to have the technology to combat these issues if we call for wholesale change to the system.
Yeah. I don't know if I imagine that there are certain people within the actual organization who would want a wholesale change. I don't think that most of the people on the ground do, but because I think that they like to work within the systems. Most people know the system. They can see its rewards. I think most of the people who are not being brought up with the tide simply want the chance to do so. Like that's kind of the sense that I get. And so I don't get the sense that the majority of people are looking for that ideology. I would guess that most of them don't even understand it. I just think that most of them, you hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, and that's something we can all get behind. Just like in the 60s and 70s, they said, I am a man. That was the placards they held. I'm a man. They just wanted to be counted as equal. I'm a man too. I see you're a white man, I'm a black man, but I'm a man, so I have value there in my humanity. And I think that's all the Black Lives Matter phrase. That's why I think everybody should be able to get behind the phrase Black Lives Matter, because it's declaring the imago Dei, right? Like we're declaring the image of God on these people, and so I think that carries value. But I don't think most people know or understand or want an actual change. There are certainly people. There are certainly people who want that. There are certainly people who are seeking for bigger changes than I think the majority of people would want. Yeah.
I think that particularly after the George Floyd incident happened, I saw a lot of people who were traditionally like right of center swing behind the Black Lives Matter organization nominally because Black Lives Matter. And, everybody was hurt by it, so they wanted to take to the streets and express their support for the Black community. My fear is that, so I agree that it's not a majority pushing for like neo-Marxist rebellion, but I'm a little bit concerned that the minority that is maybe in power positions within the organization, maybe in power positions within our politics, seems to me like maybe they have handlers. I don't know, can't prove it, so it might not be worth talking about. But I want to separate the move for racial equality and the promotion of Black well-being. I want to separate that from Black Lives Matter, the organization. And mostly because there shouldn't be a conversation about Marxist revolution attached to the conversation about Black well-being. It's taking away from a healthy dialogue we could be having. That's where all the straw men keep popping up. It's just they're all over the place once we start seeing these fringe elements inside the organization doing things like rioting and mobbing and all the rest.
So let me speak to that just for a second, if you don't mind, because I think this is one of the problems with how we have not adopted the phrase wholesale. If we would have done so 5 years ago, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. Kind of a weird illustration. Back in the 60s and the 70s, the church was using television for evangelistic purposes. I was working with a church in Scotland, and they were telling me the story about bringing a television into church to show the Billy Graham Crusades and how it brought revival to the community. So here's the church using TV, and then at some point the church decided television was evil, and so we took our hands off of it, and look where we've gotten ourselves. Hollywood's a disaster. 5 years ago, if you were listening to the people who were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the thing that they said gave it its strength is that it had no leaders. A really good documentary to watch, and this will again probably come up a little bit later as we talk about police reform or prison reform, is the documentary 13th that's on Netflix. And one of the guys in there, he said something that I found just fascinating. He was going through history and talking about the different leaders within the Black community, and all these different Black leaders, and this one was killed, and then 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 this one was sent to prison for life, and this one had to flee to another country for their life, and you've killed all of our leaders. And so he was talking about the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement was that there was no leadership, because then you can't kill our leaders anymore. And that was kind of the statement that he was making. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And no, now that documentary is several years old. And so here we have now people that don't like the Black Lives Matter movement because of the organization. And I think, if we had just bought into this 5 years ago as a nation, if all of the white people would have said, yes, Black lives do matter, and we'll support you, and we'll come alongside of you, and we will suffer with you, and we will try to bring justice where it needs to be brought, et cetera, et cetera. If we would have done all of that 5 years ago, I don't think we'd be talking about a Black Lives Matter organization. It's almost like we've shot ourselves in the foot with this. And I'm not sure that's all true. I'm not sure. I don't necessarily have data to back that. But I do, like, it's very telling that the people who were very proud of the movement 5 years ago, part of their pride came with no leadership. But now if you go to the Black Lives Matter website, they have their leadership, like, here's our leaders. And it's like, well, that's not who you were 5 years ago. There was no leadership 5 years ago. It was just a thing. And so I think that I'm not sure what the answer to that is, whether we need to find some new way of phrasing it that carries the same weight, or whether we just need to be able to say Black Lives Matter, and let's find some ways of actually supporting organizations that believe in the concept, but not in the ideology of the Black Lives Matter organization.
One of the things that's frustrating for me is that the organization is making it to where the phrase it carries weight, it carries meaning that it shouldn't carry. I should be able to say Black Lives Matter without people thinking, oh, he wants to defund the police. Oh, he's against the biblical concept of a nuclear family, like in other various mission statements that they have, the organization has. They've taken a phrase, right? They've taken a phrase that we should be able to say, and they've added meaning to it that it really shouldn't have. And even like the all lives matter is now that's like a racial epithet. It's like, it's if you say all lives matter, well, you're just trying to take away from Black lives. And I think that that's a problem in our discourse, in our dialogue publicly, is how these phrases tend to get loaded down with almost like parasitic meaning, like parasites of meaning, sort of latch on to a good idea and turn it into a not so good idea. And then it becomes difficult to talk about things because of that. So is it possible to separate BLM from the broader movement for racial equality, or has the snowball gained too much mass? And like, how could we separate it? Do you have anything else you want to say on that point?
I think we can. I think we should separate them. But I think maybe what we should be doing, and I'll just speak of this from a Christian perspective, there are organizations that use the phrase Black Lives Matter, but also have nothing to do with that organization. And our Christian organization, there's one called Be the Bridge, and so they talk about this. Let's unite. Let's bring this together under the lordship of Christ. And so there's a Christian organization, evangelical Christian organization, that supports and this unity that we need in our country. So I think maybe what we need to do is we need to say things like, I believe Black Lives Matter. And so let me show you people who are saying and doing what I think we need to be saying and doing. And so as opposed to talking badly about the one, we talk positively about the other. This is a common problem we have evangelizing anything. The illustration I was given when I was in college is we tend to go and talk to people about Jesus Christ, and if they have another religion, we insult that religion. We try to tear that religion down rather than showing them the beauty of Christ. And so I think maybe if we want to support the Black Lives Matter movement but not the organization, we just do it like that. We need to be aware, and I think if I'm aware of the negative repercussions of one ideology, I can talk about that as we get further into the conversation, but maybe at the outset of the conversation, if I want to separate the two, then I find something else to speak very positively about within the broader mindset of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so let's just talk about those. Let's focus on those, and then as we go further down this road, we'll talk about the specifics of why we don't support this. We think that's harmful for our nation, and not even as a Christian. Like I think even a non-Christian can look at some of the ideology of the Black Lives Matter organization and say that's not going to be good for our country. And so, as a Christian, I think it's on me though. Like it's not on the people that I'm trying to communicate with. I need to not tear down what they're trying to support. I need to instead encourage what they're trying to support and show them the ways that I'm with them. That's how I think we can do better that way.
It really is sort of symptomatic of the fact that we aren't having these conversations, because if somebody says Black Lives Matter and you've never had a conversation and you never will have a conversation with that person, then you don't know whether they support the fringe elements of the group or whether they support the good cause of the group. In the same way, I wouldn't want people to cast aspersions on Christians because of cults inside Christianity that are very unchristian. We wouldn't want people to judge the Christian church on the basis of its worst actors. And we can do that. We can separate those things if we're having the conversations. And I think that's why there's so much division, where like people right of center, anything that discusses Black Lives Matter or has BLM on it is toxic to them. They just don't want to go near it because it speaks of the worst elements of the ideology. But the truth on the ground is that not everyone, most people who are ostensibly supporting the movement are really actually trying to support the Black community, which I think is something that we can get behind. We just need to know who is supporting what. And in order to do that, we have to open up the lines of communication.
Yeah. One of the things that I don't know if you have heard Lecrae speak on this, but Lecrae posted a video about a week ago, and he talked about this specific issue, and he said, some of you aren't using the phrase Black Lives Matter because of all of the other things. He says, I don't care if you use the phrase. It doesn't matter to me. I just want you to live like Black Lives Matter. And I really think, like, I don't use the phrase. I don't use the phrase in public. I don't use it on social media because it can carry weight both ways. There's just I don't need to do that. I just need to try to show by other actions that I believe Black Lives Matter, and then I don't need to say the phrase. Now, if I'm going to go marching and I want to hold a sign, I suppose that's fine. But for the most part, I avoid using the phrase itself unless I'm in a context where I can talk it through a little bit more.
Right. Let the tree be known by its fruit kind of thing. Just live it out, and then people can know it that way. Okay, so the next point that I wanted to go over was, you and I agree that we never want to see another George Floyd video. How can we prevent police brutality if neither side, left or right, can agree on its cause?
Well, I think that dealing with police brutality falls primarily on the shoulders of those in power. So both police officers themselves and those who are over them. And so regardless of whether they can agree on why these things are happening, I think they can certainly agree on we need to punish it when it does. If this man is accused of murder, he should be thrown in prison and his pension should get taken away, or and any other types of police brutality. Like, we use the phrase, a few bad apples, and that phrase is used a lot, but we have to finish the phrase. A few bad apples ruins the bushel. And so if we leave the bad apples in there, they destroy it. And I know, like, I know that there are police forces that have bad apples that have risen too far in the ranks, and what's happened is it has ruined the officers underneath. And so somebody who would enter into that situation, who would be the ideal police officer, will either be ruined or they will get kicked out. And I was just reading the story a couple weeks ago about a police officer who he was new to the police force. He had a partner that did something that he shouldn't have done, and he reported him. He did what he felt like he needed to do. He went to his superior officer. I think he wrote something up like he actually filed a report, and he was just treated brutally by the rest of the police. They changed him to someone else. He was constantly being harassed. And all the people that should have supported him in that. Now, that might be once in a million, right? I'm certainly by no means suggesting that that's a universal problem. I don't believe that it is. Again, I'll restate it because I think it needs to be restated. I think most police officers are good police officers. But the way we can make sure that number, that percentage continues to increase is by making sure that when one police brutality thing happens, that we take care of it. And so regardless of whether it's an issue of race or it's not an issue of race, we need to take care of that officer. He needs to be punished immediately, or he needs to face consequences. Whether that punishment happens, of course, court of law, the stuff we talked about earlier. But
it's definitely a huge, huge problem if a psychopath rises to the leadership position. I agree totally that we'll end up creating a filter where people will either follow that person in his ways and the whole precinct will be ruined by it, or they'll be kicked out. That's definitely something we have to avoid, is this idea of people who shouldn't be police officers not only being police officers, but rising to leadership within ranks of police officers, because then it does seem to have that cascading effect. This is another thing that really frustrates me about the people who have tried to commandeer this movement, because I'm hearing a lot about removing funding from police, and that's not to make the straw man of defund the police, because I think that's definitely a straw man, but even if we remove resources from police, I think that's a bad thing, and I'll try to make the case. I think police training and psychological evaluations are the key to reducing police brutality. We have to remember that officers are only human and are bound by the same flaws that we are. Most police brutality can be reduced to, I think, one of two causes. Either the officer was inadequately trained or the officer had malicious intent. Increased and consistent psychological screening. So I say consistent because you need to screen them at the beginning, but then you also need to keep screening them in case something outside of their work happens that causes them to derail. You don't want them with a gun and a badge in that situation. I think that increased and consistent psychological screening can help reduce malicious intent and prevent departments from hiring bad actors, and it would also prevent those bad actors from rising to leadership. I think that more funding for police training programs can help reduce inadequately trained officers. So right now, the average police officer gets between 2 and 4 hours per year in defensive tactics and combatives training. So this is like hand-to-hand, how am I going to subdue the suspect with hand-to-hand combat? I actually really liked the idea that came from the former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink, who himself trained other SEAL leaders. He claims that this 2 to 4 hours per year of training is not nearly enough to be proficient in safely subduing a suspect. If an officer is not skilled enough to subdue a suspect with non-lethal force, they end up having to use lethal weapons. And Jocko suggests that police officers should be trained a minimum of 1/5 of their time on the clock. So this could be like an 8-hour day once a week or 2 hours every day. I mean, they could break it down however they want, but it seems to me that there's nothing more dangerous than an insecure person with a gun and authority. If they're rolling up on a situation where they're going to face physical violence, hand-to-hand violence, if that is putting them in an uncomfortable situation, like if they don't know how to handle that without pulling their weapon, they're going to pull their weapon. And I don't think I agree with the chokehold ban. I understand why they're doing it, because an improperly administered chokehold is lethal, is fatal. But a properly administered chokehold doesn't have to. And I think the more of these non-lethal restraints and non-lethal tactics you take away from an officer who's already not trained enough, they're going to start the interaction closer to lethal force than they would had they had those other tools.
Yeah, so I like what you're saying. I definitely agree with a lot of this stuff of what you're talking about, like with training and stuff like that. I think that that's one of the things that I've been just trying to study up on this. Is just this idea of how little training you have to do to be a police officer in many places. Now, of course, some raise that standard, but like the standard's fairly low for becoming a police officer as far as the training and so forth you have to undergo. And so we need to increase that, and I think part of that is just increasing it on the go. One of the other interesting things that I heard, and this had to do, this was in Michigan, I think, but it was in a very violent part of the city. Actually, I think the whole city was just their count was high, all their numbers were high. It was just a very, very dangerous place to be a police officer, and the police officer count was low. There weren't enough of them, which is another issue entirely. But one of the things they talked about was how much it helped police officers who always worked nights to take a week or two and work during the day, because the street corners look differently. The people look differently in the light than they do in the dark. And what it did was it helped the police officer just gain a completely different perspective of the community that he's policing. And so that's part of, they were talking about, but they just didn't have the funding, or they couldn't get it done, or whatever. Maybe it was union stuff. I don't know. I don't remember exactly why they couldn't see that through. But it seemed like in that particular instance, part of it was simply getting a police officer to where he was dealing with those same people when it wasn't always crime. It was just, because most crime happens at night, not during the day. And so let him walk those same streets with those same families, see those same kids and their moms and their dads, and be able to spend time in the community in the daylight as opposed to the night, and just cycle that through like every 3 weeks. And they found that psychologically that really helped the police officers to not, because they would enter into those situations, kind of like what you were talking about with the lethal force, and like, do we need to, should we take those kinds of things away, like the chokeholds, because they felt more defensive and aggressive from the moment they got into their police cars at night. And if you're starting out the night that way, possibility is that if something happens, you're going to escalate it far too quickly. And so I'm for that. And a lot of this defund the police stuff, I did not understand the defund the police stuff, but when I started studying it, a lot of the defund the police stuff actually makes a whole lot of sense. The defund the police stuff, a lot of that is simply, we need to stop spending money on these major weapons, and we need to start spending more money on training, and we need to take some of the jobs the police officers are doing, and we need to make them not do those jobs. We need to give those jobs to other people. like social workers who can actually work with drug addicts better than a police officer. What's a police officer supposed to do with a drug addict? He has to arrest him and throw him in jail. That's his job. That's what he does. Maybe social workers can move into those situations and help people and help create better environments for healing and for getting over your addictions and so on and so forth. So again, the defund the police thing is kind of like the Black Lives Matter organization. When you first see the defund the police, it sounds really ignorant and stupid, but when you begin to actually dig into what they're talking about, a lot of that actually makes a whole bunch of sense. Sometimes it's just taking some of the funding and reallocating it, or taking some of their jobs and giving it to somebody else who maybe has more qualifications than they would, and let the police officers do the work of police officers, the serve and protect and those sorts of things. So I don't know. It's interesting, but I like the idea of helping them by training. I think that's a good. That would make a huge difference to have ongoing training all the time.
I can hear what you're saying about how, like, why do you need a fully weaponized officer to handle a kid who's smoking some weed behind a building? It doesn't seem to make sense. We can also talk about prison time for marijuana, which I think is just not a good idea at all. Just a little bit of pushback I would give is that it seems to me that the people who are supporting that idea of maybe sending social workers or sending people who are less threatening, the line they're drawing is between violent or nonviolent. And my question is, if you know that police aren't coming, is that line going to shift? Are situations that were not violent because police were coming, are those going to turn violent when they know, oh, it's just a social worker? It really comes down to trying to figure out who needs taken off the street because they're a threat versus who just needs help. And I agree that you don't want to send the wrong tool for the wrong job. I just don't know if the job morphs if you know ahead of time that, okay, if I'm doing this and this and this, I don't have to worry about police. All I'll have to deal with is social workers.
Yeah, well, but I agree. I'm with you. But I think that's why we don't send social workers in their current status. Like, today's social worker may not be able to deal with some of these cases. A lot of these cases are like home disputes and stuff like that. Like, you don't necessarily need a police officer to come in and calm a guy down, or tell some parents to be quiet or turn down the radio. We can find other people to do that who are able to enforce laws if they need to. Maybe this is just training different types of police officers. Maybe that's what it is. And so we have police officers who are trained to do social work, who still have the authority of the badge, but have training in a different place. They're not necessarily trained to go after victims or bust down doors and all of those things, but they are trained on some of the more de-escalation type of interactions with society, and I think that would help the overall appearance of the police officers, because then you have somebody who is clearly that type of police officer show up, and you're not automatically afraid, because this probably isn't going to turn into an aggressive situation, because this person is specifically trained to not get aggressive. But on the other hand, if the police officer shows up who's clearly trained, then that sends a signal to the people that, okay, this is the police are taking this seriously, and so maybe it actually helps the situations not to go too far one way or another. Because I guess when I'm talking about social workers, I'm not talking about, like, again, not in their current setting, but like social workers who are wearing a badge or something along those lines. They are there with authority. They are authority people, but they also have authority to actually step in and do things that will help the person rather than simply arrest them. Because I know police officers who, if they catch somebody with drugs, they have to arrest them, even if they don't think they should, even if they know this person's got almost nothing, but if I arrest them, this is the third count, and I have to arrest them. I have to throw them in jail. They're going to get a big sentence. It's bad for them. It's bad for their families. But these police officers, their hands are tied because of the way the law is established. And so, well, what if we could change that a little bit? I think overall we could improve things.
It might help sort of the idea of if you're always shouting at your children, eventually the shouting is not going to mean anything to them. Whereas if you use gradations of force with somebody, if police represent, okay, things have really gotten serious now because the police are here, I think that's the image we want. But are we losing that if police show up for every single thing? And if police are hidebound to charge you with something they don't think they should and that you're just going to end up getting off of anyway, how many of those repeated incidents end up eroding a sense of authority with the way people view police? Another thing that's exacerbating this problem is this idea, this narrative that's being sold to the Black community that police are dangerous to them. Because now you have situations like this is only going to get worse in the sense that like if we don't figure out ways to address situations without escalating them, even the presence of a police officer now is just going to make people fear for their life in certain instances. And that fear alone, you have a fight or flight response in that situation. And you could just look at like the Rayshard Brooks case in Atlanta, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But you just don't know if it's in his head when he decides to run, if it's in his head that, he just doesn't want to go to prison, or if he's afraid for his life. Like, we don't know because of how much this is being sold to people that police are hunting them or after them, And I don't know anybody who, apart from highly trained, maybe soldier types, I don't know anybody who, if they believe that their life is being threatened, that they just completely act rationally all the time. And I think we're creating a situation where even the presence of an officer is going to make people feel like their life is being threatened. And that's not a good recipe, I don't think.
Well, I'll tell you from the voices that I'm hearing, they're all scared. Like I was listening to an interview with a man who was talking about, he was a Black man, and he was talking about how his dad trained him when he was driving. He said, okay, so what do you do when you're pulled over? When I'm pulled over by a cop, I pull over and I keep my hands on the steering wheel at all times. And if I'm going to reach for my wallet, I tell him I'm going to reach for my wallet and where it is. And I tell him as I'm doing it. And all of these things, and it was a white guy that was interviewing him, and he says, you know what my dad told me when I started driving? He said, just don't speed, or just pull off to the side. I forget what exactly it was, but like he was going through all these things, and so there's already this fear, and I think whether we understand it or not, that the number of Black people who are pulled out of cars and have guns pointed at them versus white people, there's no fear of that happening to me. It's never happened, but it happens to. All you have to do is look for them on Twitter right now. I mean, as this last couple of weeks has proceeded, they've flooded my Twitter feed. This isn't news stories because I don't watch the news about this stuff. This is personal examples of people who are being pulled over by police officers and having guns pulled at them. One video that I was watching, there was a man and he's driving and he gets pulled over. And the officer asks him if he has a gun. He says, yes, sir, I have a permit. There's a gun in the glove box. And the officer tells him to get out of the car. And he's like, why are you asking me to get out of the car? I haven't done anything. You haven't even told me why you pulled me over yet. And they pulled a gun on him. And so there's a reason they're afraid. And in the Brooks case specifically, well, I don't know all the ins and outs of that. I did watch a video of something that happened to him, of like an interview that was being done with him prior to this event. And he talked specifically about being afraid of cops and how he was afraid of getting pulled over and afraid for his life. And so I can't judge everything based on that, but it seems, connecting the dots, that he feared for his life and he ran. And was it rational? I'm sure it was not. But that's what he did, and he was killed for it. And what that ends up doing is that just ends up confirming all of the fears that the Black community continues to feel with police officers. Whether it's right or not, whether it's racial or not, it doesn't matter. And I have a hard time denying that it's racial sometimes and in some situations, simply because of the disparity and hearing them talk about being pulled over by police officers and their reaction to that. Just stuff I've never faced. I don't understand it.
Sort of the main thing that you hear a lot from right of center, what you hear a lot is, well, why were they resisting? Why were they resisting? That's why this happened, because they were resisting. And while I don't disagree with that from the police officer's perspective, I have to try to think about, okay, if you believe that this person wants to kill you, are you just going to go along with every command that they say? You often hear people asking why they have to get out of the car, for example. Well, that becomes a very legitimate question if you're afraid that person's going to kill you. And I think we can establish on the data that that narrative that that person's going to kill you is just not true. But in a sense, like you said, it doesn't matter whether it's true, it's whether people believe it. That's what's going to govern their response in that moment. And that's one of the things that frustrates me about left of center politics is that they push these incidents as if they are the rule. I think that that's what leads to the conversations that parents have with their children about this is what you do if you're in this situation, because the parent believes that that child is going to be at risk if they ever encounter a cop and they don't want anything to happen to that child. But I don't think we're helping the cause by spotlighting these examples of police brutality as if they are the rule, which not everybody does, but some people are doing. I particularly sympathize with the Brooks case because I watched the video, and on the basis of the video, it seems like he was so drunk that if he had survived that encounter, he probably wouldn't have remembered it. I can sympathize with him in the sense that I've been in those situations where alcohol just takes away your judgment. And if you have underlying fears of the police trying to hurt you or something, I could definitely see where it would be within reason to want to get away from them and want to try to defend yourself. If I try to put myself on that other side and think about it, it kind of makes sense. But it's just sad because I don't believe those officers intended him any harm. And I think that the people who are mostly responsible for floating that narrative, I think that they share part of the blame for his death, if indeed he was running because he was afraid for his life.
In that, kind of in that vein, this documentary 13th, one of the men who's a historian, he's, I got his title, he's the director of the Center of Excellence in Teaching and Learning and professor of history at Grandview University. It's in Des Moines, Iowa. He says this, and I think this is part of what goes into this. Is like we talk about, they don't need to be afraid because of these statistics, but we forget the generational part of this. And this is what he said. It's kind of a longer quote, but he says, if you dismiss black complaints of mistreatment by police as being completely rooted in our modern context, then you're missing the point completely. There has never been a period in our history when the law and order branch of the state has not operated against the freedoms, liberties, the options, the choices that have been available for the black community. And to ignore that racial heritage, to ignore that historical context, means that you can't have an informed debate about the current state of blacks and police relationship today, because this didn't just appear out of nothing. This is the product of centuries-long historical process, and to not reckon with that is to shut off solutions. And I say that because, like, we say, well, it's just not true. Well, it might not be true in the last 5 years, but all of these, a lot of those parents that were teaching people my age, like if you're 40 years old and your dad taught you how to drive, he was living during the Jim Crow era. And so, like, that is real to him. He faced police brutality, and he's seen it all of his life. He's never seen anything else. And so now you get into this place where there are laws in place that are disparaging toward black people. I'm sure we'll get into some of this stuff a little bit later when we talk about the systemic racism problems. But there are certainly laws in place that punish them at higher rates than they punish white people. And so if that's true, and if that is linked to drugs, which are found after searched cars, then I don't want to get out of my car and have you search my car, because if you don't have probable cause, I don't have to get out of my car. That's the law. And so if you're going to tell me to get out of my car, I'm going to say no to you, because if you would happen to find some drugs in here, maybe even they were my buddies, then there's going to be some issues. I'm going to be thrown in prison for longer than I possibly deserve. And so it's not so much... Sometimes it's that they're afraid for their lives. Sometimes it's just that they're afraid of getting arrested unlawfully, and the sense that that they're sort of seen as in society, they're seen as more likely to have committed a crime than white people, even though, again, that's not true either. White people commit just as many crimes as black people per capita. So that's especially when it comes to the drug. I'm speaking specifically, I guess, of drugs, but when it comes to drugs, white people and black people do the same amount of drugs per capita in the United States, and yet black people are more likely to be arrested and have longer jail sentences. And so how do we deal with that? How do we how do we deal with that when it comes to the black people within our country? And we have to face that reality that this has been going on since the foundation of America, since slavery came to our country. We have treated them as less than, and so we have to kind of deal with the generations that have come before. Even if we say, well, in the last 5 years, the numbers show this. Well, yeah, but in the last 200 years, those numbers didn't mean anything. Those guys were lynched for whistling at a girl 60 years ago. So we have to reckon with that as a white community, I think, if we want to have an honest conversation about where that lies, the relationship between the black community and police officers. We have to come to terms with history. And I think the black community is, at least the ones that I've talked to, I can't talk about everybody, but the ones I've had personal conversations with, they understand that we've come a long way and that things are better than they were before. And I acknowledge that we still have ways to go, but they recognize that things are better, and show a lot of respect for the police community. And so some of them don't, but most of the ones that do are the older ones, I think, by large, by percentage, I mean.
If you are able to look at the last 50 years, then you can see that the last 10 years are better. I think informing yourself historically is a good idea and is necessary for the conversation. When Martin Luther King talks about police brutality, he's referring to the Jim Crow. And I don't want to make that equivalence. You know what I mean? I don't want to suggest that the police brutality we see today, we need to make sure that we keep the context of what Jim Crow was and that those activists were fighting Jim Crow. There's this push against the police right now that would make you think that they're participating in Jim Crow, like that the police are. If we don't know the history, then we won't know if it's getting better. Like, I really do think that there's a lot of people. I mean, if you just walked the streets and asked people if more black people got shot last year by police than white people, I think a high percentage of those people answering that question would say yes. And I think that's because of the narrative that's been constructed around police brutality. We have to look at the data that we have right now and also know the history. And then we get the truest picture of what's going on, and then we can respond to it properly. It's not a situation where, oh, well, it's just on the safe side to support a movement that's fronting a narrative that Jim Crow is here and alive. It's kind of like giving chemo to a person who doesn't have cancer. The cure for a problem can do a lot of damage to race relations and to police community relations, and you might be chasing a phantom. Do you think that some of these police brutality cases could have been avoided if the victim had been practicing proper respect for authority? There's no doubt that a lot of police brutality happens independent of how the victim is acting. Philando Castile was one where he seemed very compliant and still got shot. Daniel Shaver was just an absolutely horrific video. That guy was white, but I saw that as I was doing my research. I think that we have to put ourselves in the police position too, because we forget sometimes that America is a highly weaponized nation. I mean, there's more guns than there are people. And so if you're an officer, you have to factor that in every time you're making a stop, which I think is why they should be trained better, because a highly trained officer is more likely to be able to keep his cool longer because he won't feel like the situation's outside of his control. If you're in a situation where, okay, we know there's a lot of guns in America, there's a reasonable likelihood that this person has a gun in their car, and I've pulled them over. If you start there, and I kind of feel like officers probably start there just because they think they have to, or maybe they're trained to, maybe it's a good idea to start there, to start assuming that someone's armed. But if you assume that someone's armed, which is a reasonable assumption to make in America, and then you feel like you've lost control of the situation, well, then it's starting to look an awful lot like a gunfight.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any major thoughts on this. My only thing is that I always think that the onus falls on those who are in the highest places of power to do the most they can to resolve situations as peacefully as possible. And so when a person is being disrespectful, one of the things that American police officers aren't really good at is de-escalation. And I just think we could do better at that. Like, as a people, we're not good at it because there seems to be a very American mindset of power means control, and control means that I have to shout louder or I have to prove my dominance over someone else. And And I think our police officers would do probably well by just learning some de-escalation stuff, some de-escalation techniques, and maybe we could learn that from police officers of other countries. I know other countries are very good at that. My wife was in Argentina, and she was talking about she witnessed an incident at the airport that was happening, and a man was getting very violent and throwing things. And these police officers just kind of came around him and de-escalated the whole situation, and ended up walking him away very peacefully at the end of this incident. Now, it took them some time, but I think the time's worth it if it means it saves a life. And so that's my only thing. But I definitely think that we need to show proper authority. It just seems unfair to me to be telling people who are constantly afraid of police officers that they need to be more respectful. Like they should, right? It'll help them. It might save their lives, but at the same time, we need to kind of recognize the fear that's innate in them, and that is going to cause them, like you were saying earlier, it's going to cause them to act in ways that are irrational. Fear causes us to do irrational things, and so we always kind of have to go into those situations, I think, knowing that. Actually, one of the things that was heartbreaking about the Philandro Castillo case was, if you watch the video, which is just heart-wrenching, that police officer, I would guess it broke him. Like, young, probably didn't really know how to handle the situation. That was in the midst of a situation kind of like what we're in right now. There was a lot of racial tension. It had just come up again, and so I think that was right after which case was that right after? Anyway, it was right after another big case. It was kind of like the Brooks situation. And so the police officer was certainly terrified, probably scared walking in, and so he acted irrationally. He acted out of fear. I think that goes back to your earlier stuff about training and helping them to learn to do those things. But anyway, I think it needs to be both sides. We need to be careful there. But I think the weight of it always should fall on the people in authority. I just think that's true in any situation. The weight of responsibility falls on the people. The buck goes up; it doesn't go down. And so the police officers in that situation have the most authority, so they have the most responsibility. That doesn't mean they can control everything. It doesn't mean that they don't need to use force at times, but I think they should be trained to not use lethal force as often as possible. But I don't think we disagree there.
When you said about how it's not really fair to ask people to respect the authority of people who they think are threatening their lives, we exist in a climate where Black people think that police are going to hurt them. Since we exist in that climate now, we could work on dismantling the narrative that's made them feel that way, but we should also train police officers to understand that, look, every time you stop somebody who's Black, that person's going to think that you're going to try to hurt them, and so you need to act in a way that favors de-escalation. And the shouting, some of these police brutality videos, there's a lot of shouting, particularly in Daniel Shaver. It was really disturbing. He's just like playing this sadistic game of Simon Says with him and just shouting these orders at him, and the kid's sobbing in the hallway. It's really horrible. You would think if you're already terrified and then the person's being hyper aggressive with you with their speech, then it's going to undermine your ability to think clearly and act rationally. Even if you put somebody up in front of other people, like on stage, they freeze up. A lot of people have fear of public speaking. Their brains stop working once they go up in front of people. And so anytime you have an immense amount of fear brought into the situation, it stops you from being able to think and process information as you would if you were calm. So calm is definitely the order of the day for both parties involved, I think. Let me ask you about chokeholds. I spoke a little bit about chokeholds, but I don't think I got your opinion on that. Is it a good idea or a bad idea that they're banning chokeholds?
So I talked to a former police officer about. We were just talking about the case. I didn't bring up chokeholds. He did, and he was talking about the fact that he'd used it many times, used them, and because that was part of his police training. And I hear that, and I hear good training. It's a way to not use excessive force, hopefully in situations where it's deemed necessary. I'm not for taking stuff like that away if it can be used. to help police officers. I do worry that we react strongly to these videos and we take stuff away from police officers that really helps them to do their jobs and to do them. Because I do want to keep the police officers safe, as much as we can. They already put their lives on the line, and to ask them to risk that by possibly, I don't know what the options would be, but maybe there are other options. And I guess that's the other thing that I don't really know, and while I'm not sure I have a strong opinion on this, it's just that there might be better ways of doing it. There might be better ways of holding people that officers with a little more training could utilize these holds that would never put somebody's life on the line, or at least, I guess not. There's no never, but this is much less likely. It has nothing to do with the neck. Maybe it's some other body part. Maybe it's something to do with the arms or the shoulders or whatever. I don't know what the answer is because I'm not trained in that stuff either. But if there's something that people who are trained, who know holds, would say to me, there's actually a better way they could do this, and they'd really take away this risk of killing a person, I would say, well, then let's train all the police officers to do that. If there really is nothing else, then I don't think I'm for taking it away. It's better than tasing them, which seems to be one of the other options that they're utilizing. And I'm not a big fan of tasing. If we can keep away from that as well, I think that tends to escalate instead of de-escalate at times unnecessarily. Not all the time, but and so anyway, I'm not sure that added much to the conversation.
It's good. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Rayshard Brooks. One thing I'm mostly interested in here is I think that they overcharged those officers. Now, I'm not saying that the officers shouldn't have faced some kind of consequence for what happened, but death penalty, murder with a death penalty, I think it's overcharged. I think that they sort of gave tortured reasons as to why they were going to charge them with that. Like, for instance, I think they said something like, since Brooks was jovial for certain parts of the interaction, that kind of indicates his intent of goodwill toward the police. And then he was also peaceful for like the first 40 minutes of the interaction. Now, I watched a lot of the video, almost all of it, and I thought that they were sort of mishandling it a little bit in how they were trying to joke with him. Like, they asked him, what'd you have to drink? And he said a margarita. And then they asked him later and he said a daiquiri. And then they're like, oh, you sure you didn't have any margaritas? They're kind of like playing with him. And I thought that was sort of inappropriate. But once the fight starts, once that's taking place, I guess I'm open to your opinion on this, because in some sense, shooting somebody who's running away is like, But although he did have a taser and you don't know if he's going to run away. If he hits them with the taser, knocks one of them down, is he going to come and take your gun and shoot you with it? You just don't know how that situation is going to play out. And the problem with saying, okay, it's okay to resist and run and not face consequences for that. The problem with saying that is that we're going to end up with lots of people just totally losing respect for police authority and resisting every time, and situations where the table would be turned and police officers would start being killed. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't know that I have a lot of thoughts on this case in particular, just because it is a murky one, and I admit that it's murky. But it was kind of funny. So police officers are discouraged from doing police chases with cars because the damage that you can cause doing a chase is greater than whatever the outcome might be. And so almost never do they do police chases because they'll just find them later. And part of me thinks, why isn't that true with a guy who's running away from you? Like, you know who the guy is. You have his ID. You have him on video. He's clearly drunk. He's not going anywhere and doing anything. Why are we so worried about chasing him down if we can avoid? And I don't know if that's the answer, because I actually haven't watched this video. And so I don't know if that's the answer. I really don't. I don't have strong opinions about this one. I feel like it could have been handled better on both sides, from what I understand, from what I've read and so forth. And it could have been handled. I know he was afraid, and him being drunk is not going to help that at all. He's going to be much less likely to submit to the authorities as he should. It's a lot more likely to be belligerent. Probably less likely to be able to aim a stun weapon, a taser, at the officers, though, as well. So, like, that goes both ways. He might by chance get one, but I'm generally opposed to shooting somebody who's running. Like, I think you can find better ways of doing that. Maybe you chase them from a distance so that you're not close enough for him to tase you until he runs out of energy. Maybe you wait until the next day and go to his house and arrest him. Maybe that's not the best way either. I don't know. I'm not suggesting I know the answer to these questions. I'm just saying I think we have to. I think if lethal force is the only solution, I think it better be a major problem. I don't think that's the case in this particular situation. I think we could have done probably better than that.
It may have been that the taser was the wild card in that situation. Like, I've seen lots of videos of officers running down people over the course of miles through alleys and all the rest. It seems to me like, well, why wouldn't they just do that here? But if they thought, well, okay, maybe he's going to turn into an aggressor, I don't know. This stuff probably happens so fast, which again goes back to training and that sort of conversation. Another thing before we get off of the Brooks case, do you think that we are heading towards mob rule? Because I'm sort of nervous that this case is going to either result in the officer sort of being sacrificed at the behest of the mob, or the officer being acquitted, in which case Atlanta is going to be in trouble with riots and maybe even other places, as we see this stuff seems to be happening globally.
Yeah, it could be. We have different degrees of murder for a reason. There's a reason we talk about homicide that's not intentional homicide. And so I think we need to learn to utilize those better. And I think if historically we haven't, then there's no trust from the mob. I don't think you deal with that by giving them too much of a sentence. And so now if the people who are watching that video and have looked at all the evidence really believe it's first-degree murder, then I suppose you try him for first-degree murder. But if you try him for first-degree murder and it was only third-degree murder, that case is going to get thrown out, and they're going to go free. And so that it's a problem. Like I heard they were talking about this with the Floyd case, because he was originally charged with third-degree murder, and then it got increased to second-degree murder. And they were the people who were examining that at first when they said third-degree murder, they said, well, they're doing that because they think they can get him for third-degree murder, and they're not sure they can get him on one of the higher counts, one of the higher charges. And I don't always like that. I don't like playing the justice system that way. If it's first-degree murder, it's first-degree murder. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the justice system we're working with. And so in the Brooks case, if it was third-degree murder, that's what they should be tried for. If it was first-degree, that's what they should be tried for. And that's it. And maybe it'll end up being mob rule, but I don't know. I pray not. My hope is that we're going to be doing better overall as a nation. I'm hoping we're moving toward a place where our justice system is more fair to everyone, where there is true equality when it comes to the legal system. And if we'll get there, then these cases, maybe a case where somebody would get off, if that's the outlier. I want that to be the outlier and not the rule, which I feel like it is right now, unfortunately.
There's a small part of me that is kind of nervous that because of what happened after Floyd, I'm a little bit concerned that these guys got overcharged and that there is a conceivable reality where all of these guys walk. There's been situations where people who are just dead to rights guilty have walked. And I think that if you have a situation where your prosecutor says, okay, look, this is what we got him on. And it's like, okay, well, there's angry mobs outside that say you need to be doing this. And then it's like, okay, well, I'll cave to that. And then it's like, well, once it dies down a little bit, once the heat dies down and we actually get down to the courtroom and we talk about it, it's like somebody who's talented at defense might be able to get those guys off. And then I just hate to think, what would take place after that. But okay, so a couple years ago, I toured a Civil War museum in Harrisburg, and I saw all kinds of devices and practices that whites used to use on blacks to dehumanize them and to hurt them. I don't see these things happening today. And it seems to me that the racism of a bygone era was much more concrete and easy to define. And so my question is, do we need to be more specific when discussing racism today, or is the definition intentionally vague?
I think we need to be more specific, but I don't think it needs to be defined the same way as the things you saw in the museum. I think racism is broader than that. though it's not, it's maybe not as broad as some have suggested. So I think we need to define it. I think we need to find some way of talking about it using whether it's the definition you gave, or others. I actually had found one as well, and it was a dictionary, an online dictionary, and it just said it is a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's race is superior and has the right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to the others. And so I think that's a pretty solid definition of racism as well. I thought yours was as well. I don't think that we need to argue necessarily over one of those versus the other, but I do think that we need to define it. We need to call it what it is so that we can call it out when we see it.
It is true that there are certainly racists in America today who are not putting into practice Civil War era treatments of black people, and it's largely because they can't. And they would probably if they were allowed. So I guess that just because some of those things are in history doesn't mean that the attitude which manifested itself in those practices is gone. That's a good point. I'm hesitant to suggest that not being a racist means embracing all parts of every culture. I actually do believe that there are certain parts of certain cultures that are superior to other cultures. I think it's the Aztecs killed 84,000 people in 4 days because there were tenets in their culture, probably in their religion also, that required them to do that, that spurred them on to do that. I mean, human beings can develop some pretty nasty cultures, and I think there are bad parts of white culture, there are bad parts of black culture, there are bad parts of Asian culture. I feel like a lot of the people who are pushing for racial equality are pushing for cultural equality, and I'm hesitant to just declare that, okay, well, we should treat all cultures as equal as we treat race, because I don't think race and culture are the same thing. I try not to conflate them because a culture is changeable. Race is immutable. It's your skin color, or it's part of who you are and you can't change it. I'm always hesitant to tell people, look, you're perfect just the way you are, and if the world doesn't appreciate you as you are, then the world needs to change, because there are no limits to that. It's totally moral relativism at that point. I want to reserve a space where I can say, look, this isn't meeting the mark, and this isn't meeting the mark, and this isn't meeting the mark. And I want to be able to call that out in every culture. And the only place I think I can do that is with Christ-like values. I think that he sets the authority, and if we can do our best to, and I'm not saying that we should be judging other people in the sense that Christ judges them, but we should at least be able to say, okay, Christ-like is better than not Christ-like. And that applies across the board. That's where the culture and the race thing, when they're sort of tied together, I get nervous about that because I don't want to totally surrender my ability to call out problems in cultures.
Yeah. I think my concern with that kind of a question too is so in the United States, what about black culture would we consider sinful? And I'm not sure I know what the answer to that question is. I don't think that there's necessarily anything that's inherent to their culture that is sinful, especially given that they are Americans. They and I say that in the sense that they're not the Aztecs. They don't have some religion that forces them into this place where they're killing people for the sake of religion, and so. What about their culture would it be that we would specifically put our finger on and say, okay, so we love your culture, but you've got to leave that at the door because that's not Christ-like. And I'm not sure I know what that would be. I'm not sure I would have anything that I could put my finger on and say that about.
It's kind of difficult to define culture, and I think maybe it is too broad to say black culture or white culture. Maybe it would be better to say something like gang culture or some kind of specific way of labeling a culture within a culture. I think the moment something gets celebrated broadly, it becomes part of the culture. I don't want to fall into moral relativism out of a desire to not appear racist. Let's talk a little bit about systemic racism. What is it and how do we prevent it? And do you agree with people who call for a wholesale change of the American system of governance and economics?
I don't like the word wholesale. So I guess I would not agree with anyone who thinks we need wholesale change. There's certainly systemic racism. I mean, that's not really a theory. I think that's been proven time and again from many different ways of looking at it. Because when I'm talking about systemic racism, I'm talking about how the systems that we have in place have been unfairly advantageous to white people, and so those are the things we need to change. We need to change, and that goes from redlining back in the 19th century to the disparity in our education system, which needs fixed. There are these things that we've just sort of almost accepted as part of life, and they just shouldn't be. The fact that a young black boy versus a young white boy who are raised in white community versus a black community, there's zero question that one of them gets a far greater advantage in life than the other one does. And that's a problem we have to fix. We, as a country, we have to step in and make that right. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't think it's wholesale change, because I think there are a lot of parts of that system that we can redeem, that we can make better use of. But we have to be cautious, I think, doing that, because we don't want to do it at the expense of actually hurting the people. Because I think we've tried to help black communities and done a very poor job. Gentrification is a great example of us trying to help black communities and just doing a terrible job of it. And so we need to do better than that. So how do we actually improve the life of people in these poor communities, and not at the expense of the whole, but really let's lift us all up. But we have to acknowledge what's there and what's harming people if we're going to do that.
I've been wrestling with this idea of systemic racism because I'm hearing a lot of people just saying it without pointing to, okay, which laws are holding black people down? Like, can we point them out so we can get rid of them? It's like, well, we're not going to point them out. So, okay, so it's sort of just this thing where our systems are operating unfairly. So I did a little bit of digging to try to figure out what I could about systemic racism. And the earliest I could find the term used was in a 1967 book by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton called Black Power. These guys referenced systemic racism as specific individuals doing specifically racist things to hold black people down. So like an example they used was a real estate agent refusing to show certain apartments to black renters. I think that the term systemic racism, it's like sufficiently evolved to where it no longer points to specific individuals or specific legislation. Now that might be because it's being politicized, because I think there are people who recognize the footprint of systemic racism. Like you were saying towards the end of your comments, you were saying we need to get down on the ground and find out what part of society is disproportionately unfair to what specific individuals so that we can correct it in that situation. And that might vary from neighborhood to neighborhood or from community to community. But it's hard for me to have an effective conversation about systemic racism until it gets down to like pointing out.
Well, let's talk about the education system.
Okay.
In America. I think we can talk about this. This is systemic racism that's due to redlining. Do you understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about redlining?
Redlining is where like insurance companies and banks and mortgage companies would not service certain communities because they were black, and so people didn't even have like a bottom rung of the ladder to grab onto. So
redlining, if you're gonna try to break it down a little bit more, is this idea that there were certain communities that are sort of outlined that this is where we're going to allow like this flourishing homes, and we're going to allow growth in this area, but we're not going to allow. And back in the 50s and the 60s, they had specific things set out that white people cannot live in these communities. And so, black people cannot live in these communities. They're not allowed to move here. They would not give them. And so what that created white communities. And so what businesses would end up doing is businesses would end up moving into those communities, which raises all the property value. And so meanwhile, all these black communities, the property value continues to plummet. Jobs move out, which means black people have to transport to get to work, which is furthering the problem if they can even find a job outside of their community. What happened with the education system then is that the education system is primarily based on property taxes and property value, and so if you have a black community and a white community, the differences are going to be pretty stark. So there was a study done I think it was in 2015, and they talked about the disparity between school districts, and they used there were two states where it really stood out. One of them was Illinois, and the other one was Pennsylvania. They showed it all over the place, but they were specifically focusing in on Chicago and Philadelphia. And so Chicago was the worst one, but since we live in Pennsylvania, I pulled up some of the Pennsylvania numbers. And so there are these two school districts that are very close to one another in the Philadelphia area, and the expenditures per pupil are drastically different. In one of them is the Allentown School District. The expenditures per pupil is $14,854. In Salisbury, it's $22,000. So that's like, if you're black, you are worth 67% of this white people, this white community that's just across town. Like this isn't across the state. This is just across town, and that's partly because of the house assessment value. The house assessment value in Allentown is 110. The house assessment value in Salisbury is 209. And so because of this vast difference, and so if you live in a poor community, which are of course not all black, but because of redlining, they are majority black now. So because of the systems that were set in place that are no longer in place, but because they were already in place 50 and 60 years ago, the black community hasn't been able to really redeem themselves from this. And so, the illustration that's often given is you have two people that are in a race and they're running for a mile. Well, if you give the white person a quarter mile head start, that's not fair for the black person. He's not going to be able to catch up that quarter of a mile. And so now maybe he's a great runner, so he gets to be the outlier. Right? So he gets to be, maybe that's Usain Bolt running against me, and he's therefore going to win, even though I get a quarter of a mile head start. But what's most likely to happen is that the white person is going to get a better education. They're going to be better equipped to face the world. A white person is more likely to be recommended for advanced education if they have a white teacher. They are more likely to be able to get jobs because they have white names. I've heard story after story of people in the black community whose parents gave them white people's names so that they could get job interviews. And so this is something that I've never had to face because I'm white. But you get these systems that are in place and these implicit biases that am I saying those teachers are racist that are more likely to recommend a white person than a black person? Of course I'm not. But there's this implicit bias against black people that they are somehow less educated because they're black. And of course, sometimes that's true because they're in poor school districts. But even when they make it into these better school districts, they're less likely to make it into the advanced programs if they have white teachers. If they have black teachers, it's equal. If they have white teachers, it's 50%. They're half as likely to get recommended for an advanced education as their white counterparts. And so these are systems that are in place. I mean, this is statistical data. This is not. This isn't my stuff. So that's one area of systemic racism. Another big area of systemic racism began back in the 80s, and that's with the crack cocaine versus the powder cocaine. Crack cocaine was easier to get, easier to transport, more likely to be sold in the poor black communities. Powder cocaine was more likely to be sold in white communities and in Hispanic communities. And so if you had 1 ounce of crack cocaine, your jail sentence was going to be just as much as if you had 100 ounces of powder cocaine. That's 100 times the jail sentence for having 1 ounce of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And so because all the politicians were talking about the dangers of crack cocaine, well, so what's happening? So all of these, I believe the number was 5-year minimum sentence. So you had a 5-year minimum sentence if you had 1 ounce of crack cocaine. You had a 5-year maximum sentence if you had 100 ounces of powder cocaine. Now, that's very different, two very different things. And so what they're doing is they're going into these black communities. They don't have jobs. They haven't been educated. They've turned to drugs because their fathers are all in prison. And so what are they doing? Well, they're all getting thrown in prison as well. And so it's caused these systems that are in place that we need to fix. Now, I'm not for throwing money at these problems. I don't think that helps anything. I don't think that throwing money at people who are poor is going to suddenly make them rich. I mean, it's going to make them rich for a week, but like if they don't know how to handle that, if they aren't educated enough, and so what we need to do is we need to start at the bottom. everyone knows that if you want to make a community better, you begin with the education of the children. You begin generationally to bring them up. And so we need to deal with the disparity between the black communities and the white communities, the poor communities. It's really a poor versus rich thing. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that it's not this particular thing is not necessarily race. It's historically based. It's historically racist because it's historically the systems that were put in place against black people. And so, of course, today you have white people that live in those communities, and they are just as much at a disadvantage. But because they're white, they have other advantages. They have other advantages that black people don't, such as their name, their skin color, more likely to get job interviews, more likely to get hired, less likely to get pulled over by police, less likely to get searched, less likely to get thrown in prison for drugs. And so you have all of these things that are coming into play that have nothing to do with anything about who they are inherently. It's merely about the color of their skin and the way they were raised. And so these are just a couple of the issues. And again, I think we're going to talk about some more of them maybe later on. But when we talk about the prison system, because the prison system is pretty messed up. But these systems that are in place give an automatic disadvantage to those in poorer and primarily minority communities.
In the situation of redlining, for example, it seems to me like what we're dealing with now is the consequences of redlining. Like it's created a negative feedback loop, and that's a problem. But I can't find the law. Like we've already made redlining illegal, and I don't disagree with the fact that there's after effects that still exist. Maybe you can inform me on. You were talking about the 1980s and the crack cocaine. Is that still active?
So under the Obama administration, it was in 2010, he changed that. It's still disparaging. It's now not 100 to 1, it's 17 to 1. And so it's not as bad, but it's still bad. But that was something that he brought some reform to.
I think it's indisputable that we have disparities that are a consequence, you could say a direct consequence of things like redlining, which it's almost like an evolution. Like you start at slavery, then you get to Jim Crow, then you get to systemic racism that could be identified in the law. And then you have the after effects or the negative feedback loops that only black people have to deal with, that white people don't have to deal with. My question is, what do we do about it, in the sense that so it seems to me like we have to make a couple bad decisions in order to just shatter the negative feedback loops. And the first bad decision, I think, is granting the assumption that black well-being is a one-to-one function of how much racism exists in a society. I hear a lot of, inequality equals racism. It seems to be what's being offered as a solution. And the problem with that is that there are other things which lead to inequality. Like black people are human agents with hundreds of influences, and I don't see them as like weather vanes responding to the sole input of racism. And so it's less about disputing the reality of the difficulties that are exclusive to black people, and it's more about trying to sort out how do we respond to it. Because if you tell a person, okay, look, it doesn't matter how hard you try or what you do, you're not going anywhere because the system is stacked against you. I don't know how that doesn't just call forward the worst in a person, in the things they can control, they let go of because they've been taught to believe that they're indefinitely going to be a victim.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, I think we have to start at the foundation of the problem, which is the schools. And so if we begin by saying whites are equal to blacks, poor are equal to rich, it doesn't matter who you are, you're equal, then every public school should get funded exactly the same per student, period. That seems to me to be a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. It's not a no-brainer because all the rich people who give money to the politicians live in the rich white areas, and they want to make sure they're getting more money. And so that's why it's not happening. Mm-hmm. It's politics. And so we have to acknowledge the problem and then fix that problem. But the other thing that there was something you said about this idea of racism that I think we struggle with today when we use the term racism. I think a lot of people deny racism exists out of a place of privilege. If I get to define what racism is, I'm never going to be racist. And so if racism is hating somebody, then I'm never going to be racist. But if racism is being okay with them being at a disadvantage because of their skin color, I think that's racist. Like when people first had slaves in America, they defended slavery by saying it's good for the slaves. When well, we're not racist. This is good for them. When people were supporting the Jim Crow laws, they supported the Jim Crow laws not because they were racist. They're not racist. They support Jim Crow laws because that's what the black people want. They don't want to hang out with us. They don't want to sit with white kids. Let them have their own bathrooms. And so, and of course, all the stuff that came with that. And so, this day and age, we've done the same thing. We've said, well, I'm not racist because I don't believe in Jim Crow laws. But sometimes there's these biases that we've allowed to be strengthened and to be supported. And because we haven't defined them as racism, because we haven't used the term, we think we're kind of steering clear of this. And I think that's a problem, because if you try to see it from their perspective, if you try to hear their stories, I was thinking about this. I was thinking, if you're a young man who's going to a school, and you walk into a school that has the name of a Confederate officer who fought for slavery, and you are taught in your history books, and they talk about how awesome Christopher Columbus is, and they never talk about the Tulsa riots, and they never talk about redlining, and they never talk about the Great Migration. They never talk about Juneteenth. You never learn the history of the negative things that happened to your people, because we've whitewashed that away. We don't even want to talk about how we've mistreated them for years past. We don't want to talk about how we've hurt them and have effectively caused great harm to them as a people. And so we do that, and we completely ignore their history. So meanwhile, here's this kid at school, and he's being told by his classmates, his white classmates, that they're not allowed to date him because their dad says he's black and he's probably a thug, or he's probably into drugs or whatever. He doesn't even have his dad around. Maybe his dad's in jail, or maybe he's not, and that's just an assumption that's made on their part. And he deals with this day in and day out. And so, like people that are in the know, the people that talk about this from kind of a study at a PhD aspect, they talk about this in regards to microaggressions. Racism in the past was very much macro. It was very these big things that we did to people, and we're not allowed to do that today because society says it's bad. And so we have all these microaggressions. And so here's this young man who day after day after day has to go into this environment where he's seen as lesser, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. So meanwhile, he's seeing white students get better education than he is, even though he works just as hard and has just as good of grades. By the time he graduates, they're getting scholarships that he's not getting. They're going to colleges that won't open their doors to him because they got into the advanced programs and he didn't. And so all of these things have happened all of his life. And then we come to him and say, well, come on, man, pick you up by your bootstraps. That's why Martin Luther King said, I can't pick myself up by my bootstraps if I don't have any boots. And that's, we've kind of stolen their boots. We've kind of taken all their power away from them. And some have busted through that. We're thankful for those people. But this is where the systems that we have in place and are ignoring the microaggressions of racism that do exist and that they encounter day in and day out. They'll tell you that they have to wear their hair a certain way if they're going to get a job. They have to. They're more likely to get an interview if they have a white name as opposed to a black name, and of course they startle people then when they walk into interviews. I just heard this week. I just heard a story about a lady who was given the name of a white boy, and she asked her parents why, and they're like, well, it was your grandma's name or this or that, and she pressed them on it. She says, no, why did you give me the name? And they said, well, the reason we gave you the name is because we wanted you to get more job interviews. And so this is their reality, and I think our problem in America is we don't believe them, because we've defined racism as Jim Crow laws, and so we don't believe in the microaggressions of racism that happen to them every day, because it's from a place of privilege. I'm white. I don't have to deal with microaggressions. I'm a white man of all things. I'm the most privileged person in society, and so it just gives me the freedom to not have to think about stuff. And I think that's a big problem with the systems that we have set in place in the U.S.
I think that the issue that I have with white privilege is that I can't tell the difference between white privilege and just majority privilege. It seems to me like these same things would be true if you were Chinese in China or if you were black in a majority black area. If you're in the minority, those privileges are endemic to being in the minority, and they're less about... I think the reason why so many white people are unwilling to deal with the very real negative feedback loops which have been instantiated by systemic racism, like redlining and things we can identify, the reason why they don't want to deal with them is because I think they're expected to take responsibility as if they did them. And I think that there's probably people alive who are guilty of trying to hold black people down. But I think that most white people today, they don't wake up consciously thinking, I'm going to do anything I can to undermine the cause of black people. I think we have a better shot of getting them to pay attention to the real problems that exist if we take the blame off of them first. This kind of goes back to the idea of group identity and collective guilt. I just don't think it's very useful to lay the sins of our forefathers at the feet of people who are alive now and then reference the fact that we can do that because the effects are still here. I'm certainly not going to dispute that the effects are still with us. They're still with the black community, the effects of bad people. But to suggest that the effects still existing means that the people who also exist who are white are equivalent with the people who instantiated those effects, I think is what shuts down the conversation. I think it would be better if we were sort of talking like, look, black people face injustice and face disparities that are a consequence of these things that happened a long time ago. You're not responsible for these things. You don't need to feel guilty for these things, but we need to take more of a positive tack. Like, okay, you don't need to atone for these things, but at least try to help fix what we can demonstrate is a real negative feedback loop which exists, which is making things harder than it needs to be for the black community.
I don't disagree with you, but like it's the same thing about a lot of these other things we've talked about, like Black Lives Matter. Now I have to spend 10 minutes qualifying Black Lives Matter. Okay, right. So defund the police. Now I have to spend 10 minutes explaining defund the police. White privilege. Now I have to spend 10 minutes explaining what white privilege is. And what does white privilege mean? It means that I have privilege because I'm white. That's it. It doesn't mean that I have to feel guilty for being white. It doesn't mean that that I'm responsible for paying back black people for the sins of my ancestors. And I got to be honest with you, outside of the political world, I'm not hearing that at all. Most people who talk about white privilege, that really address white privilege, they say the only thing we want out of people is to acknowledge that you have privilege, that you're white, and then use it. Like, just use your white privilege to support people that are suffering. I heard a story just this last week, 2 weeks ago maybe, and it was a man who is a musical artist. He's in the Christian industry, and I don't remember his name though. It doesn't matter. But he was at a concert. He was doing it as a church, and he was doing it with some other people. He was the only black artist. The other artist was white, and so he was at his table and selling albums after the concert, and the pastor walked up and made a racial slur to him, like it was a very, very was not a very healthy thing to say. And he was just kind of stunned, didn't know what to do. And so this other guy that he was on tour with had recently adopted, he was white, but he had adopted a black girl from Kenya or something like that. So he had been talking to them. He'd been talking to them about how do you raise black kids in America in this place, and like, what are some things I need to know? What are some things I need to prepare for? And so the conversation had already been opened. And so as a way to kind of further that conversation, he brought up this story. He's like, these kinds of things are going to happen. And he said that from that point on, every time the concert was over and he was standing beside his table, his white friend was standing there beside him to make sure that if a racial comment was made, his friend could step in and stop the conversation. And he said, and the musician was trying to make the point, he says, that's utilizing your white privilege for the sake of your black brothers and sisters. And that's the thing I hear again and again and again. It's not that they expect us to reparations. That's a politics thing. That's not on the streets. On the streets, it's more just stand with us, weep with us, acknowledge that you have privilege, and use that privilege for the sake of your community and for the sake of others who are suffering. So I don't have a problem with. That's why I don't have a problem with white privilege. I recognize it, I acknowledge it, and try to use it whenever I can. Sometimes it costs, sometimes it costs me to use that term and to talk about it openly, but regardless, I do it.
I want to talk just a little bit more about color blindness, because so if you say, like, this kind of ties in with the white privilege, because if you say, okay, look, I'm colorblind, and if when you say that, what you mean is I'm determining whether or not I'm going to hire this person on the basis of their merit. So by definition, I'm not looking at their skin color. I'm looking at their abilities. I'm looking at their behavior. I'm looking at things which are not their skin. And if I'm not looking at things which are their skin, I can be colorblind. Colorblindness has sort of become like a right-wing talking point, or it's thought of as a right-wing talking point. Like, oh, you're just saying you're colorblind because you're denying your privilege. But the earliest references I could find where this term was being used, and it actually comes from major black progressives like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King. And I think the way they meant it is the way people right of center who say it actually do mean it. When I say I'm colorblind, I'm saying that I want to judge you on the content of your character, which is what Martin Luther King thought was the ideal. In that sense, that's what colorblindness was to him. But now if I say it, it's like, oh, well, you're just denying your privilege. And unfortunately, I think that that's one of those breakdowns in communication where, like, I don't know anyone who would, if they're really good at something, like you said, if they're really good at something, they don't want to be like, okay, well, we're going to hire you because you're black. Like, we want to hire you because you're good at it. The action of hiring you because you're good at it is like a colorblind action, in my estimation.
I understand where the colorblindness thing comes into play, and when I hear people use it, it kind of depends on their sentences before and after it that I determine whether or not I agree with them. Because I've heard white people use it and I've heard black people use it, and I think both meant well in some cases. I have heard some white people say it in ways that I did not think I did not appreciate the sentences around that phrase. And so it's kind of like everything else. It's whether if you're talking about white privilege, in a sense, that white privilege means that I have to feel guilty for being white. I'm not into that white privilege. If you are saying Black Lives Matter in the sense of Marxism, I'm not into that Black Lives Matter. And so I kind of approach colorblindness the same way. I avoid using all of those phrases. I don't talk about colorblindness, white privilege, or Black Lives Matter. I don't use the phrases because they're hot button phrases, and I don't mean what most people. I probably don't mean what anybody. We all kind of take our own little turns in the road with these things.
One more thing about racial profiling, then we'll move on because we're running a little long here. I would agree that racial profiling is a clear-cut example of systemic racism, where the person being profiled who didn't do anything wrong is an actual victim in that situation. And I don't deny them that at all. Like, I think that if you're upset about being profiled, you're right to be upset about being profiled. I would just say that it might be more productive to direct that righteous anger towards the cause of the profiling rather than towards the institution which is doing the profiling. For instance, TSA stops and searches more Arabic men than they do old white women. And the reason for that is because Arabic men are more likely to do something bad with a plane. And so in that situation, yes, it's not fair if you're an Arabic man who gets searched every time you go through TSA. But the reason you're being searched is not because TSA is just endemically racist against you.
Well, it probably only applies to that particular instance. I just think, like, if I'm a TSA agent and my boss says, listen, if they're from, that part of the country, that part of the world, you need to pull them aside. I would just say that. Like, I just don't understand why we can't say those things. Like, pull them aside and say, listen, you understand the history here. I'm sorry that I have to do this. You're probably fine, but this is a historical hotspot for the United States, and so I'm going to have to do this. And I think that sometimes we just need to acknowledge that we're being unfair, and that the person that we're being unfair to is not the cause, and we're trying to not make it worse than it needs to be.
Right.
And I think sometimes that it's kind of like this whole conversation. if we would just talk more, we would really help ourselves a lot. And so I don't know if that's the best answer to that. I don't know how that works into other avenues, like people who don't get job interviews because they have black names versus white names, and people who get pulled over in affluent neighborhoods because that's a white neighborhood and you're black. I mean, these things happen. And again, these are stories I hear every week. Like these aren't like out of the blue. These are, because I'm trying to listen, these are stories I'm constantly hearing. Just this week, I could give you 4 or 5 of these types of stories, and I'm not going to do that. But like these things, they're constantly happening, and so we have to be careful with that. And I think even that will be solved by having more conversations. And by businesses, you talk about hiring people or giving people promotions that are worthy of the job. Well, that has to start at the interview process, which means we need to have people interviewed who look. If the resume looks good, forget the name. Let's just judge by the resume, and then we'll bring them in, and then we'll talk.
This is something that sort of struck me as odd as I was watching all the tension and things that was happening after George Floyd. I thought to myself, well, okay, this is an interesting question. If America is as racist as, let's just call it, the broader movement claims, why does being labeled a racist remove all of your credibility and make you irredeemable in the public square? Wouldn't being labeled a racist in a racist country be like a badge of honor?
I think this goes back to how we define racism. And I think because we've defined racism as, we've officially, we've moved past slavery, so now racism means Jim Crow. And so people who live as if Jim Crow were a thing or vocally demonstrate that they would like that to be a thing, those are our racists. And so we define that's what a racist is. And so those are the bad people. And then all of these other ways of being racist, these biases and these systemic issues, those are ignored by the majority because they're not seen as racist. But the minorities would certainly say that they are being oppressed, being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin.
I think I'm going to stay away from the universities and the cultural Marxism just because those are huge topics, and we've already been at it for, I think, going on 4 hours. So maybe just one more, and then we'll hit the closing question. Did you want to talk about prison reform at all? I know that was kind of like something you probably had a lot on. If you don't want to, that's okay. I mean, I take your word for it in a sense that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think if people want to talk about or study about it, I think just study up on the 13th Amendment and understand why that's in place to continue slavery under a different name, and how the privatization of the prison system has made that situation all the more worse. And actually, this goes back to the part of the reason I wanted to talk about this was because of something we talked about earlier with these big companies. I have no problem with big companies as long as they're not doing it on the backs of the worst people in our society. And unfortunately, what's happening is a lot of them are doing it because of slavery that's allowed by the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment being slavery is not allowed in the United States except in the case of a criminal offense. And so what they've basically done is they've given themselves an excuse. And so since 25% of the population of the world, 25% of the people that are imprisoned in the world are imprisoned in the United States. We have a quarter of the prison population in the world. And the reason for that is because of the unjust laws and because of the 13th Amendment and how the prison systems are keeping as much as they can in order to raise the money. So if people want to, if you want to, a lot of this you can find in that commentary, the documentary. 13th. It's on Netflix. It's actually available on YouTube right now too if you don't have Netflix, or you can read The New Jim Crow, which is a book that was written about this concept.
Okay, awesome. Look, I've had a really great time with you tonight, and I've learned so much. I mean, I've learned more in the last few hours than I've learned probably in the last month or so that this has been going on, and people have been sort of bantering back and forth. And I hope that this turns out to be an example of what's possible. I was definitely coming from more of a right of center view on a lot of these issues, and I think you were coming from a left of center view. And what we found out was that a lot of the things, what I learned through this is that a lot of the things that I'm skeptical of, they almost seem like straw men. Like they might not be straw men if you're ascribing them to certain actors, but in a lot of cases, what we're worried about are bad people doing bad things. I don't know, how the division gets solved going forward, but I think that if we focus on like seeing the person behind the conversation, that was what was so good about doing this is like, I already know you and I know that whatever you're bringing to the table, it's not base level ideology. That made me super interested in doing this because it's like, well, I can learn something out of this and I can become more well-rounded as a consequence. So do you have any closing thoughts?
Nope. I like what you said. I just think relationships are important. Building a relationship with people that don't look like you and worshiping with them and eating together and real conversations. It's a good way forward.
Steve Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you enjoy this podcast, please rate it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. You can follow the MHB podcast on Facebook or Twitter at MHB Podcast. Tell your friends about it and share it on social media. If you'd like email notifications of new episodes or if you'd like to support my work directly, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on my website at mhbpodcast.com. This work is made possible by listener support, so your generosity is greatly appreciated. Thank you all for joining me, and I will see you in the next episode.